This page of the N64 Magazine cover, issue 19, it's a proper throwback to 98. Right in your face is Turok 2, the big dinosaur hunter game, with the tagline, "Played it, and it bites. More guns, more gore, more roar." They're shouting, bit much like, but that was the style back then. It's got a massive dino head, taking up half the cover, all teeth and angry eyes, yeah. Turok was always a bit over the top, but good fun for blasting dinos. Ringura. They've reviewed F-Zero X, calling it the racing game to die for. Bit dramatic, weren't they always? Mission Impossible is in there too. It's here at last, but has the wait been worth it? Remember the hype for that game, it was supposed to be amazing. WF Warzone gets a mention. Survival of the fattest. Sheer wrestling brilliance. In pants. In pants? Bit of a weird one there. And for those stuck on Banjo-Kazooie, there's tons of tips. A complete solution apparently, page 67. Banjo was brilliant. Everyone loved Banjo. Looks like there's also some Japanese and US news and reviews if you were into all that import stuff. And little mentions for Top Gear Overdrive and Hybrid Heaven at the bottom. All you need for your N64 in 132 pages, they reckon. Good times. This page is the welcome page to N64 Magazine. It's issue number 3, from September 1998 it seems. Right at the top it's boasting about being Britain's biggest and best-selling Nintendo 64 mag, which they all did back then, didn't they? The editor, James Ashton, is saying to keep your voice down, as Tim is playing F-Zero in the office. He describes F-Zero as brilliant but difficult, and mentions it's the first proper N64 racing game, which is true enough. Wipeout 64 was alright but not quite the same thing. He also mentions a Frankenstein game, Dr. Frankenstein, and WWF Warzone, which Acclaim were pushing out at the time, saying something about the creator-player mode, and joking it might be disrespectful to Mr. Miyamoto. Bit harsh maybe. Baikiswai. They're making a point of saying they are independent from Nintendo so can write honest reviews, which is always what you want to hear, isn't it? They also say they review games as soon as they come out in Japan and America, so you know what's coming. And they only focus on games you can buy here in the UK. Fair enough, no point teasing us with stuff we can't get. They've got correspondents everywhere it seems getting news, and they don't copy stuff off the internet, which again in 98 was a bigger deal. The internet was still finding its feet really. They mentioned Banjo-Kazooie saying it should be in the shops, and there is a massive guide in the mag starting on page 67. He finishes off saying enjoy the issue. Oh, and at the bottom it says, don't be fooled by feeble imitations, which is pretty standard magazine bravado. There's a picture of the editor looking stressed, and a big old dinosaur eye staring at you from the side. Classic N64 magazine style really. This page of the N64 magazine contents were in September 1998, issue 19 it says there. Right then, let's have a gander. First up, Planet 64, the news bit, kicking off on page 14. Looks like they're teasing 14 new games, which in those days was quite a lot to keep up with, to be fair. Micro Machines 64 gets a shout out. Always a bit of fun that for multiplayer madness. Crimbo is mentioned, and some mystery rare game, which is always intriguing back then. Wonder what that turned out to be. There's a screenshot of Ocarina of Time, standard stuff, and what looks like Pocket Monsters Stadium 2, or Pokemon Stadium 2 as we'd call it now, seems to be the Japanese version judging by the text. Then we've got N64 Arena, page 40 onwards, all the reviews and that. Mission Impossible is in there, accept our mission it says, with a picture of Tom Cruise looking all serious. Iggy's Wrecking Balls, page 46, Acclaim trying their hand at a puzzler, asking if it's any good, which is always the question, isn't it? WWF Warzone is on page 48, fat men kick each other. Bit blunt but gets the point across, aiming to be the best wrestler yet, as they always claim. And page 52, All-Star Baseball. They reckon it's great, even if it is baseball, and importantly for us PAL chaps, it's on our system. $. Down at the bottom, the regulars section, all the usual bits and bobs. Information station on 28. For bestsellers and money off deals, good for the wallet that. Tips extra on 94. More hints than you could shake a stick at. Bit of an exaggeration perhaps. N64 Shopper, on 107, for importing F-Zero X, because PAL releases were always a bit behind, weren't they? Club 64 on 108, for questions answered by James, whoever he is, subscriptions and back issues if you're missing out, and a directory on 114 for when you've forgotten what they said about DKR, Diddy Kong Racing I assume. And finally, a teaser for next month's issue 20, on page 128, as if all that wasn't enough. Oh, and Import Arena, from page 54, Japanese and American games again. F-Zero X gets another mention here, with Nintendo supposedly working their magic, page 54 for that one. Then there's Star Soldier, Dezaimon, and off-road challenge listed as well. So plenty to wade through in this issue. Looks like a decent read if you were into your N64 back in '98. This page of the magazine kicks off with a future look at upcoming N64 games. They're teasing Hybrid Heaven, Top Gear Overdrive, Knife Edge, Nose Gunner, and Glover, all starting on different pages. Top Gear Overdrive, TGR's sequel. Apparently it's faster than ever, blimey. Knife Edge, choppers on Mars in some brilliant time crisis in space. Sounds a bit bonkers. And Glover, described as a glove, a hand, and the most original game of the year. Right then. Then there's an N64 how-to section about Banjo-Kazooie, telling you how to find absolutely everything in the game, starting on page 67. It says everything you'll ever need to know about Banjo and that grumpy old witch Gruntilda. Below that they're on about 1080-degree snowboarding and beating Nintendo at it, and something about mates in Oz and sticking one on the Barbie. Bit random. And finally, a special investigation into Turok 2, calling it one of the best games of '98. And they're showing off first looks at the latest levels with over 80 new shots starting on page 32. The main image is a bit intense. Some fella's face merged into a dino eye. Very dramatic. Oh, and a small bit about a great Nintendo car boot sale, digging up 50 classic games in Nintendo's car boot. They've got a picture of F-Zero there, good old F-Zero. Shigsy's being shoved aside, apparently. This page in N64 Magazine issue 19, it's all about a first look at some new games coming to the N64. Right on the front there's a big splash for Hybrid Heaven. Seems like they're really pushing this one, reckon it's going to be a big deal. From the screenshots and right up, it looks a bit bonkers to be honest. You're this bloke called Slader, looks like he's just walked out of a bad 90s action film, fighting some alien fella. Apparently there's a lot of cutscenes and it's all set in New York, in the subway and that. They're saying the visuals are pin sharp, which for the N64 at the time was usually the case. They were pretty good on the graphics front. Sounds like the story's a bit weird. Something about saving the US president from hybrids, typical. Oh! Then there's a bit on Top Gear Overdrive, sequel to Top Gear Rally. Not sure we needed another one of those, but there you go. Knife Edge, they're calling it Copters in Space. Sounds like your standard chopper sim, but in space. Apparently the best ever. We'll see about that. Lastly, there's Glover, the N64's most surprising game yet. They're claiming. That's a bold statement. No screenshots for this one, just saying they've playtested it. Intriguing, I suppose. Boringtonja. They're also teasing the coming soon section in Planet 64 on page 18 if you want even more new games. Always something else to look forward to, isn't there? Overall, Hybrid Heaven seems to be the main attraction here. Let's hope it lives up to the hype, eh? This page looks like a preview for a new game called Hybrid Heaven on the N64. Right at the top, it's labeled N64 Future Look, so it's clearly something they are excited about. Hybrid Heaven Alien Resurrection sounds a bit like your typical sci-fi action affair. It's got a big yellow title and a few screenshots scattered around. Looks quite moody, some dark corridors, and what seems to be an alien fella with hooks. One of the captions mentions it's not as gory as Resident Evil but just as frightening, which in '98, Resident Evil was still the benchmark for scary games, so that's a bold claim. They're showing off bits of gameplay. Slader, who I guess is the main bloke you play as, is being scanned by a machine, wandering through doors, and apparently having a bit of a ruck with a red alien geezer. There's even a mention of a subway sequence, with a red jacket character and Slader in a face-off. Sounds a bit dramatic. Release dates are there, spring '99 in Japan and summer '99 for us here in the UK. So, it's still a bit of a wait. They've slapped an exclusive badge on it, meaning this magazine is probably the first to get a good look at it, which was always a big deal back then. Overall vibe seems to be a bit serious. Dark action game. It's promising something a bit different, a hybrid of sorts, whatever that means. Could be decent, could be a bit pants. You never really knew until you got your hands on it back then, did you? Still, in '98, anything new on the N64 was worth a look. This page has got a future look at Top Gear Overdrive for the N64. Right then, it's being billed as the sequel to Top Gear Rally, remember that one? Apparently the main issue with Top Gear Rally was blurry backgrounds. Who knew? But they reckon they've sorted it now, making the environments more detailed and interactive, which sounds alright. There are a few screenshots dotted about. Looks like they've got city tracks with buildings, then there's a canyon level, and even a jungle one. Bit of everything then. One of the captions mentions a new style beetle. Seems a bit random. And another one talks about a stormy jungle level. Apparently that's what N64 racers should look like now. Ooh, we can't wait. They're also saying V-Rally 64 inches has got some serious competition from this, which is probably true. Those racing games were all trying to 1UP each other back then. They seem quite chuffed with it all, saying the bluey green bar shows your nitros. Nitros, eh? Alright for some. This page in N64 Magazine is having a look at Top Gear Overdrive, another racing game coming to the N64, and it's being called a future look. They're saying it's a follow-up to Top Gear Rally but not quite Top Gear Rally 2, more of a stopgap it seems. Apparently the first Top Gear Rally was a bit serious, all about winning and not drifting, lacking a bit of fun perhaps. Worrying. These developers, Snowblind, they reckon they've made the courses more interactive, so you can knock things over like oil drums and traffic cones, which sounds a bit like a laugh. They're banging on about power-ups now, like nitro boosts scattered about, turbo pads, oil slicks and even cash points. The cash points are for customizing your motor after races in the Overdrive garage, so that's a new twist. They're promising 8 motors to choose from, different from the last game, including Detroit V8s and even a new Beetle, plus Ferraris, Porsches and concept cars. Sounds like a bit more variety than just rally cars this time. Track-wise, they've upped it to 7, set across different seasons and weather, like fog and rain. Expect the usual hairpin bends and hidden shortcuts too, apparently. Woo! They reckon it's going to be lightning fast and a bit different to the first game with these new features. They're finishing up saying with this V-Rally 64 and F1 World Grand Prix, the N64 will be the king of driving games. Bit strong maybe, but they are keen on it. There's a little box saying US release is Autumn 98 and UK Winter 98. And yeah, there are a few screenshots dotted around, showing off the graphics and 4-player mode, which they're saying is proper fast. Tremendous 4-player action they're calling it, and you won't believe how fast it is. We'll see about that. This page is a preview of a game called Knife Edge for the N64. Right then, Kemco, they're having a go at a helicopter game, and they reckon it's a bit different to the usual blam blam chopper games we've seen before, like Blade and Barrel, or even Chopper Attack. Apparently this one's set on Mars, which is a bit of a change of scenery from your usual jungle or desert. It seems to be on rails, a bit like Time Crisis, so you're not exactly flying where you want, but you're still shooting down loads of robots and spaceships and that. They say the game changes each time you play it, depending on who you pick as your navigator and pilot, which sounds interesting I suppose, though we'll see how different it really is. Looking at the screenshots, it's got that sort of late 90s 3D look, a bit blocky but colourful. They're talking about screen-shaking explosions and Martian landscapes, and 6 big stages to blast through. They reckon November is when it's coming out, so not too long to wait to see if it's any good, eh? The reviewer seems cautiously positive, calling it the chopper game to watch. Mind you, they say that about most games in previews, don't they? Still, could be a bit of fun when it comes out. This page is about Knife Edge for the N64, looks like a futuristic shooter, bit like Star Fox if you squint. They're calling it Fire/Fly, which is a bit dramatic, isn't it? Kemco are the ones behind it apparently. They reckon it's got some massive end-of-level bosses, and they're even making comparisons to Andros from Star Fox, which is a bold claim, mind you. There are a few screenshots showing off the gameplay, spaceships blasting things, one of them going up in flames, another one looking like it's dodging lasers in a city, and another one with some sort of big alien head boss. The captions under the screenshots are all trying to be a bit clever and exciting, talking about explosive sunrise of death and Mars red rock. Bit much really. They mention the missions are set in the dark and you'll get surprise attacks, which sounds a bit standard for this sort of game. They also say it takes a bit of getting used to flying the smaller craft, but it shouldn't be a problem, so we'll see about that. The reviewer seems a bit impressed by the boss, calling it massively impressive, and saying it's got bags of character. Apparently it looks a bit like Andros, or at least they're trying to make it sound like that to get us interested. Bears an uncanny likeness to Lilac Wars' Andros, they say. Bit of a stretch maybe. Release-wise it's slated for Autumn 98 in the US, and Winter 98 over here in the UK. Seems like they're trying to build up some hype, calling it an exclusive even, with a big Mario star. They reckon they'll keep us updated as it gets closer to release. Sounds alright, might be worth a look when it comes out, depending what else is around at the time. This page in N64 Magazine, issue 19, seems to be giving us a future look at Glover, this new game from Hasbro on the N64. It's billed as an original and innovative N64 debut. Looking at the screenshots, it's certainly a bit different. You play as a glove, apparently called Glover, with a ball. Seems you have to bounce the ball off walls to collect cards for bonuses, and there's something about not losing sight of the ball. The screenshots show some slightly quirky looking characters and worlds. There's a sort of snow scene and a level with what looks like giant mushrooms, typical N64 era 3D platforming stuff. One screenshot has some text saying, "Hey man, it's cold, come chill out with me for a while," which is a bit naff, even for back then. It says cutscenes are used to add atmosphere, which was always a bit of a mixed bag on the N64, wasn't it? The release date is given as October in the US. So yeah, Glover, another slightly oddball platformer for the N64, published by Hasbro, who were known for their toys more than their games, weren't they? Could be a bit of fun, might be a bit rubbish, who knows back then. This page in the magazine is having a look at Glover, which is coming to the N64. Glover. Sounds a bit of a silly name for a game, doesn't it? Anyway, it's about this glove, a disembodied hand in fact, that runs around on its fingers. They're saying it's a bit like that old Spectrum game Head Over Heels, which is going back a bit, isn't it? Basically, it's a 3D platformer. And they're saying at first it seems like your standard affair, but then you find this ball, and that's when it gets interesting apparently. You can push the ball around, and there are different types of balls, like a rubber ball that bounces, a bowling ball to smash things, a steel ball that sticks to magnets, and even a crystal one that you have to be careful with. Sounds a bit bonkers if you ask me. They mention you can chuck the ball at enemies and even swallow it whole, which is a bit odd. There are also playing cards to collect for bonus points, naturally. They reckon it's nearly finished and should be out in October, if it doesn't get delayed like most games do. They seem quite positive about it, saying it's a welcome change from all the Mario clones, which is fair enough, there are a few too many of those about. Plays like nothing else on the N64 they're claiming, which is a bold statement. We'll see about that, won't we? Looks like they'll have more on it in issue 21, so to be continued, as they say. This page is the news section from the magazine. Looks like issue 19 from September 1998. Blimey, 1998. Feels like donkey's years ago now. Right, so the big news is about the games coming out for Christmas. They reckon we're going to be flooded with software. Which, looking back, wasn't far off the mark, was it? They mentioned Nintendo are prepping a blockbuster run-up to the Yuletide period, and claiming up to 14 new, top-notch titles by Christmas. Bit optimistic maybe, but we were always hoping for a good Christmas crop, weren't we? Zelda 64, Ocarina of Time as it was properly known, is slated for December. That was the big one everyone was waiting for, wasn't it? And they mention it will be out in Britain and Europe a month after the American N64 launch. Imagine the message boards back then if that happened today. Absolute meltdown. Warrington Hurricane. They're also chatting about Rare, of course, mentioning Banjo-Kazooie being rumoured for a Christmas release, and possibly another mysterious game. They didn't deny it, about an RPG, so that must have got everyone's hopes up for something like Conker, or maybe even something new. There's a picture of Conker there, the cheeky sod. Good times. Third-party games are also mentioned, acclaimed Turok 2, Seeds of Evil in October, Psygnosis is bringing Wipeout 64 in November, and System Paradigm's F1 World Grand Prix is also coming in October. Konami's IS-98 is getting reviewed in the next issue, and they're banging on about Kemco's Top Gear Overdrive, Knife Edge and Twisted Edge, and V-Rally 64 and DMA's Body Harvest, finally seeing the light of day after being in development seemingly forever. Basically, the gist is that there are loads of games on the horizon, and wallets were going to be weeping come Christmas time. They reckon a new game every 3 weeks in the shops. Ambitious, but it was a good time for the N64, must admit. This page, right then, it's got a few bits and bobs. Up top in shortcuts, they're banging on about some new controllers, GameStar LX4, apparently they're not completely rubbish this time, which is a step up I suppose. And EA have finally snagged the proper Premier League license, so no more made UK player names in footy games, about time, Warley. Then there's a UK release date section, very handy. September's looking a bit thin with just IS-98. October's more interesting, Turok 2, F1 World Grand Prix, Twisted Edge Snowboarding, some decent stuff there. November's packed F-Zero X, 1080 Snowboarding, Wave Race 64, Body Harvest, Knife Edge, V-Rally 64, a bit of a splurge that month. December, well that's the big one isn't it, Zelda, Ocarina of Time, 12 Tales, Conker 64, Top Gear Overdrive. Christmas is sorted then. Warrington. There's a section called Behold, Gold. Bit dramatic. It's about a GoldenEye bundle, console, gold controller, the game, all for £129.98. They're calling GoldenEye the greatest Bond game, greatest film license, and greatest console game. A bit much, but it was good. Can't deny that. Limited stock, mind you. Classic. Down below, Micro Machines 64 Turbo, coming October 21st. They're saying it's got the Micro Machines V3 engine, but with new courses and vehicles, cars, tanks, boats, even ice cream vans apparently. 8 players at once. Chaos that will be. Screenshots wise, there's one of F-Zero X. F-Zero X. Prepare to fasten your seatbelts, yeah right, as if you had seatbelts playing a console. And one of Turok 2. Blood and guts and gore. Turok 2 is not for the faint-hearted. Well no, it's not, is it? That's the point. Pretty standard N64 page really, bit of news, game previews, release dates, that sort of thing. This page is from the mag, and kicks off with a bit about Joytech going to meet Eddie Jordan to see their new N64 steering wheel, down at Silverstone no less. Bit of F1 glamour for ya. They even mentioned Damon Hill spinning out in his race, poor bloke, and Ralph Schumacher coming in 6th. Then there's a bit of a tease about a mystery rare game, turns out it's Banjo-Tooie, which, let's be honest, we all knew was coming after Banjo-Kazooie, didn't we? They're saying it's a sequel, so no surprises there. There's also something about a Robotech comic being released as a tie-in to the game, being released by Take-Two. Apparently it's already out in the States, and might come over here. Sounds alright if you were into that sort of thing. Then we have a section called Fanzine Farm. Looks like they're reviewing fanzines sent in by readers. Ooh-ha, RRRR. Morning Miss Anna, it says at the top. Bit cheeky, typical student humour. Moving on, there's new goods, all from Joytech. They're showing off a Controller Plus 64. Looks a bit like a melted controller, oddly shaped thing. Comes in different colours apparently, and they reckon it's comfy enough. They also mention a rechargeable Jolt pack, which is a rumble pack that you can charge up. Sounds handy, as those rumble packs chewed through batteries. Finally, they have an RGB SCART cable. Essential bit of kit if you wanted a decent picture on your telly back then. Proper pin sharpness, they're saying. N64 Zone is their review section. Looks like they're bigging up the N64 Zone fanzine itself, saying it's doing well. They mention reviews of Diddy Kong Racing and Yoshi's Story are in there. Both decent games, to be fair. They also have a top 10 N64 essentials list. Always good for a bit of debate down the pub. Play It Loud is about another fanzine, this one from Norway called PIL. They've reviewed it, saying it's surprisingly good for a fanzine from abroad, and it's got a unique rating system out of 100. They mention GoldenEye, Shaken Not Stirred, and Diddy Kong Racing, Shempagoi. On the front cover, GoldenEye was the mutts nuts back then, everyone was playing that. Lastly, there's EGN, another fanzine, which they reckon is a good un, especially if you're after featurettes and cheats and all that. They mention Yoshi's Story and Pocket Monsters on the cover. Pocket Monsters being Pokemon, of course. Massive craze that was. This page in the magazine is having a look at some retro handheld games, specifically the old Game & Watch series, alongside some N64 bits and bobs. First up, they're checking out some third-party bits for the N64. There's the Advanced Jolt Pack 2 inches one, which is a memory and rumble pack combo. They reckon the rumble side is alright, but the memory side is a bit dodgy with some games. Then there's the 256K memory card, which seems more reliable, apparently works fine with games like ISS 64, Fighter's Destiny and Turok, and at £8 they reckon it's a decent deal. Moving on to the Game & Watch stuff, they're looking at a few double screen ones. Donkey Kong 2 gets an 82%, they say it's really tough, proper old school Game & Watch challenging. Then Oil Panic gets a much lower 62%, they seem a bit underwhelmed by this one, calling it a disappointing example of Nintendo's gameplay design. Something about catching drips of oil, sounds a bit dull to be honest. Blackjack is next, with 59%, and they say it's a bit different for Nintendo, trying to appeal to older gamers. Apparently it's like Pontoon and could be alright if you're stuck for mates to play cards with. Finally, there's Mickey and Donald getting 77%, where Mickey and Donald are firefighters. Sounds a bit tedious and irritating actually, though they seem to think it's okay. There's also a bit at the start about someone's plant doing better now. James and Will have had haircuts. Classic office banter that. And right at the bottom it's got Jason Moore's contact details if you want to get in touch about retro games. Down in Bletchley. This page is about the footy game IS-98 on the N64, reviewing it as if it's just come out. It mentions it's the sequel to ISS and reckons it's better, especially the single player, because the computer is a bit more challenging. They reckon it's got more options too, like picking a captain to G up your team and loads more formations and tactics. Apparently the stadiums are updated to be like the France 98 World Cup ones, which is a nice touch. They talk about little improvements like shadow effects and new animations for overhead kicks and celebrations, which sounds alright. There's a screenshot of the game showing some players in action, looks like the classic ISS view. They mention the commentators, Tony Gubba, being sarcastic, which I remember was quite funny back then. They also point out the player names are still wrong, even Beckham is called Desham, which is just typical. In it, there's also a little bit where they say Batistuta has scored against England in one of the screenshots, which is always a bit painful to see again, even in a game. Sure. Down the side there's a list of games that are featured this month, including Madden 98, Twisted Edge Snowboarding, Windbag, Chopper Attack, Gex 64, Earthworm Jim 3D, Shadowgate 64, Zelda, and ODT. Looks like a decent month for games, a good mix of stuff. Twisted Edge Snowboarding and Windbag were ones to watch at the time, I recall. This page is a preview for Madden 98 on the N64, smack bang in the Planet 64 previews section of this old magazine. It's all about American football, which, to be honest, wasn't always the biggest thing over here, but Madden was trying to make a splash. They're making a point about how last year's quarterback club 98 beat Madden 98 in the charts, even though Madden had the pedigree. Bit of a blow to EA that must have been. But it sounds like they've pulled their socks up for this one. They reckon the new Madden 98 looks loads better than Quarterback Club, more detailed players and that. Apparently they've got all the official NFL licenses now too, which they say makes it look less shoddy than before. Ouch, bit harsh. The screenshots show some in-game footy action, blokes in helmets running around a pitch, proper American style. They are banging on about the realistic animation and motion-captured signature moves. Standard marketing spiel really, but back then, it was quite something seeing games try to look a bit more like the real thing on the telly. Anyway, it's pegged for release in October, so just in time for the proper football season over in the States, I suppose. They reckon it could be a winner for EA this time round. We'll see, won't we? Never know with these things. This page then, it's a look at Twisted Edge snowboarding for the N64. Right in the middle of the snowboarding craze, wasn't it? Everyone was trying to be cool with their board games. This one from Kemco, they reckon it's following in the tracks of 1080 degrees snowboarding, which was a proper benchmark back then. The screenshots are showing off some stunts and snowy tracks, with the speed and points racking up. They're banging on about how Twisted Edge is supposed to be more bodacious than 1080 degrees, whatever that means. Apparently the characters are more interesting, and the computer opponents are properly aggressive, trying to wipe you out. Sounds about right for the time. Difficulty was king, wasn't it? They mention the tracks are a bit mad, with half pipes and big jumps, and that you get speed boosts for doing stunts. Standard stuff really, but they seem quite impressed. There's also a 4-player mode which is good for bragging rights down the pub, and 5 game modes including time trial. The announcer's speech is sampled, which was a bit of a novelty back then I suppose, and they're teasing whether it's actually better than 1080 degrees, which is the big question, isn't it? Guess we'll have to wait and see what they reckon in the full review. This page is all about Winback, right then, Spy Hard it says. Bit of a cheesy title, innit? Seems like they're trying to pitch it as the next big spy game, riding on the back of Mission Impossible and GoldenEye, which were all the rage at the time. Apparently you play as Jean-Luc Cougar, sounds a bit daft, part of some team called SCAT, Strategic Covert Actions Team. Blimey, try saying that after a few pints. They're trying to infiltrate this underground base, GULF, to stop some terrorists called Crying Lions led by Kenneth Coleman, who sounds like a right villain. They reckon it's like Metal Gear Solid with the plot and the hiding behind crates business, which fair enough, Metal Gear was brilliant. They're showing off some screenshots, looks a bit rough around the edges visually, typical N64 really, but they're talking about interactive cameras and the enemies being clever, reacting to you and all that, which sounds promising. Loads of weapons apparently, flamethrowers and all sorts, so it's not all sneaking about. They mention levels set in office blocks and factories, standard stuff. But the reviewer seems a bit worried about the lack of level variety, only 4 mentioned. Still, they are holding out hope it could be a decent game. Exciting even, but we'll see, won't we? Winter 98 release, they're saying. Plenty of time for things to change. This page in N64 Magazine is having a look at Chop Nui, which is actually Chopper Attack. Seems like they've renamed the Japanese version Wild Choppers for us Brits, probably because Wild Choppers sounds a bit daft when you say it out loud. Anyway, they gave Wild Choppers a decent score of 79% back in issue 11, and this Chopper Attack is basically the same thing but with English voices. Apparently the animated characters in the briefings were always a bit dodgy. They've tweaked the controls from the Japanese version, thankfully. It was a bit of a nightmare before, with the D-pad and analog stick fighting each other. Now it's more like Turok, using C buttons for direction, and the analog stick for moving around, which sounds much better. The reviewer reckons it feels much more natural for swaying and swooping around in your helicopter. Graphically, it sounds like it's still got that fog, which wasn't ideal, but they say there's a decent selection of choppers to choose from, better than some of the rubbish ones out there. Missions are supposed to be good, and they mention one where you have to escort a plane. Sounds like your typical explosive helicopter action, with plenty of missiles and rock soundtrack, classic N64 stuff really. They'll give it a proper review next month apparently. This page then, it's an article about Gex 64, Enter the Gecko for the N64. Right, so Gex on the N64, let's have a look. They're comparing it to the PlayStation version, saying the 32-bit Gex looked cleaner, but the N64 version is a bit more rough around the edges, a bit disheveled they say, with fogging, but still fun to play, apparently. They mention it's difficult developing for the N64, even for talent-heavy houses, and they name-drop Konami, who had some games fall by the wayside like Nagano Winter Olympics 98, International Superstar Soccer Pro, and GASP. Fighters NEX Tage. Blimey, that's a blast from the past, isn't it, Nary? Looks like Crystal Dynamics are doing the N64 specific underwater sections, which is nice I suppose. They've got enemies in, and the humour is film and telly related. First level in Looney Tunes land, then Indiana Jones style adventuring, and even a horror movie level. Gex is dressed up in stormtrooper gear for a space level, apparently a Death Star type place, and then prehistoric stuff too. Sounds like they're throwing everything at it. Or you. They talk about the sampled speech being in, but with an American voice actor, and not Leslie Phillips, which they're not happy about, are they? They say the speech is clear, and there's a lot of it. Overall it's rough, not as polished as the PlayStation 1, but still fun and could find a niche, especially with Banjo-Kazooie now out. Review coming next month, they reckon. Yeah, fair enough. This page then features a preview of Earthworm Jim 3D. Remember the original Earthworm Jim games on the SNES and Mega Drive? Properly mental they were, in a good way. This one's in 3D of course, which was the big thing back then. Apparently it was a bit of a mess when they first saw it, running at a snail's pace with blurry graphics, but they reckon it's shaping up nicely now looking at these new screenshots. It sounds like they've tweaked the camera and made sure you don't fall off ledges all the time, which is probably a good thing in a 3D platformer. They're banging on about the music being accordion-based, which sounds different, and they've got level themes like fear and happiness, which is certainly a bit bonkers. Apparently you'll be skiing and using daft weapons like a pocket rocket and a pacifier gun. 32 levels and 13 weapons, they're promising a lot. Warringed. The reviewer reckons the worlds themselves are the main thing, filled with puzzles and subgames and that. It mentions a load of enemies, the usual suspects like Psycho and Evil the Cat, plus some new weirdos called Bovine Special Elite and Disco Zombies. Sounds like classic Earthworm Jim daftness, doesn't it? They're saying it's out in September, both here and in the States. We'll see if it's any good when it finally arrives, eh? This page, right, it's all about Shadowgate 64, Trials of the Four Towers. Remember Shadowgate on the NES? That point-and-click adventure where you died every 5 minutes? Well, they're bringing it back for the N64, can you believe it? Apparently this new one's in 3D, which sounds different. The article says it's like a sequel, picking up after the original, with this halfling character called Del. Bit of a daft name if you ask me, sounds like someone off Only Fools and Horses. Anyway, you're back in Castle Shadowgate, dealing with the Warlock Lord again. Seems like he just can't stay banished, can he? They say it's not your typical RPG, more about puzzles and figuring things out than bashing monsters, which is fair enough. The original was all about dying in silly ways to puzzles, and it sounds like it's strictly single player, no multiplayer shenanigans here. Apparently someone played it at E3, but said it was still early days. They even mentioned the footsteps being a bit echoey and annoying, which is the kind of thing you notice when a game's not quite finished in it. They reckon it's out this winter, so we'll see if it manages to recapture any of that old school Shadowgate magic, or just ends up being another one of those N64 games that tries to be a bit too clever for its own good. This page about previews for the N64, blimey, takes me back. Right then, let's have a butcher's. Looks like the main game they are banging on about here is called ODT, or Die Trying. Catchy title, I suppose. Apparently it's from Psygnosis's Paris studio, so expect a bit of European flair then, eh? They're saying it's a mix of action-adventure and RPG styles, which sounds a bit ambitious for the N64, but we'll see. They're boasting about 8 massive worlds broken down into sections, and you get to pick from 4 characters. Max Havoc, who's a chief engineer, then Ike Hawkins, Julia Chase, and Archbishop Solar. Bit of a mixed bunch there. Apparently each character has unique skills, and you can master loads of spells, 16 by the sounds of it, across 9 power levels. And they're going on about RPG elements, so expect lots of stats and inventory management, I suppose. Warrant noint. Looking at the screenshots, it's trying to be a bit moody and atmospheric, all dark and dingy dungeons. They are particularly excited about the water effects, saying they're stunning. Water effects, eh? We were easily impressed back then. It does look alright for the time, mind you. They're saying the viewpoint is good too. A mix of first and third person makes it easier to judge distances and platforms, which sounds sensible. Over on the side, there's a little snippet called An Ear to the Ground. Rumors are swirling that Nintendo are making a skateboarding game, and apparently the 1080 Degrees snowboarding team, with Shigeru Miyamoto himself, are involved. Could be interesting if they can pull that off. Give Tony Hawk a run for his money, maybe. And there's some guff about old arcade games coming to the N64. Battlezone and Asteroids, given a modern lick of paint. Crave Entertainment are doing those. They're also busy with Caesar's Palace and Milo's Astro Lanes. Right, well, each to their own. Recca. Oh, and some bad news for European gamers. Apparently Nightmare Creatures for the N64 won't be released over here because of some deal Sony made in Europe. Typical. Americans will get it though, published by Activision. Always the way, isn't it? This N64, which they thought was canned, might be back on. And they reckon Forsaken might be stealing its thunder. DMA Design, who did Body Harvest, Silicon Valley and Wild Metal Country, are apparently working on a fourth N64 game too, keeping busy then. UT. Lastly, they mention Empire Film Mag reviewed Fighter's Destiny and said it had two unique features. Turns out, it's not judo fighting but using the N64 analog stick and the Rumble Pack. Rumble Pack as a unique feature? Alright, calm down, it was the 90s. Still, Fighter's Destiny. Bit of alright button basher, wasn't it? Happy days. This page from an old N64 mag, looks like one from '98 maybe, has a bit of an odd mix of stuff going on. At the top there's a piece pondering about Brits and Japanese and how we both handle disappointment, especially in sport. Blimey, a bit deep for a games magazine, eh? Apparently we're similar in some ways but totally different when it comes to how we act when our teams lose. Then the writer, Max, goes a bit off the rails talking about daft N64 controller ideas. He's joking about making a Yob PAK with a syringe to calm you down when you lose at games, and an eye spray pack. Typical Max, always a bit bonkers. Then underneath that it's all about Bomberman hitting the big time. Apparently Bomberman Fantasy Race and Star Soldier were shown on this massive 500-inch screen in Tokyo train station. Imagine seeing Bomberman on your commute. They reckon it attracted loads of businessmen and office ladies, which is a bit of a weird crowd for Bomberman, but fair play. Seems Hudson, who made the game, was showing off their N64 stuff. Down the side there's a Made in Japan bit with Max again, saying he's looking at Japanese gaming and even football hooligans. Of all things. Bit of a random page really, but that was N64 mag for you. Always something a bit different. This page is having a bit of a giggle about some bonkers controller add-on called the Eye Spray Pack. Apparently you stick it in your N64 pad, and it squirts water at you when you're playing Wave Race or Mario Kart. Bit daft, innit? They reckon it's for cooling down and realism, but I reckon it's just another way to get your mates wet when they least expect it. There's also this sook and blow idea involving fans and smells for racing games, which sounds equally ridiculous. Then there's a bit about Koei's new game, Winback. For the N64, they're saying it's going to be a proper challenge to Metal Gear Solid, which is a bold claim. They've released some screenshots, and it looks alright, a bit serious and military looking. They're introducing characters called Stephen Regal and Matthew Brown. Sounds like they're trying to make them a bit James Bondish. It's not out till winter though, so we'll have to wait and see if it lives up to the hype. There's a random story about Konami paying some baseball player a load of dosh for hitting a home run at Tokyo Dome. All because it bounced off their advert. Madness really. Worry. Next up, another indispensable gadget, this time from Bandai. It's a fishing reel attachment for the Game Boy called the Grander Reel. Apparently it's for proper serious fishing games, like Grander Musashi RV. Can't say I'm convinced, but each to their own. Péché. Oh, and Nintendo has finally announced the Game Boy Color. About time, eh? It's going to be £89.99 and is out in September. They're saying there'll be a couple of color games at launch. To try and shift more N64s, they've dropped the price a bit as well, down to £140. Trying to tempt us with color, are they? Lastly, there's the usual learn Japanese bit. This time it's part 15 and it's all about humility. Right then. This page of N64 Magazine is doing a special investigation, and it looks like they've gone all the way to Texas in the US. Apparently Iguana, the game developers, are based there. It's all about Turok 2, which back then was a massive deal, the sequel everyone was waiting for. The page is dominated by this massive iguana eye, which is quite striking, and if you look closely you can see Turok himself reflected in it, looking a bit angry as usual. They're clearly trying to build up the hype for this game. Lookery. The text starts with the reviewer being quite impressed, saying even the developers must be amazed at how good Turok 2 has turned out. They're laying it on thick, calling it bigger, darker, scarier, more violent and better looking than the first game, which, to be fair, for the time, Turok on the N64 was pretty impressive visually. They mention you play as Joshua Fireseed, or Turok, as we all know him, and you're up against this nasty piece of work called Primogen, who's apparently already wiped out half the human race and wants to finish the job. Sounds cheerful, doesn't it? It also mentions that Turok 2 actually had a shorter development time than the first game, which they reckon is because Iguana used the engine from the original game. But apparently, that's where the similarities end, as the levels are supposed to be much bigger this time around. So, all in all, it's a pretty glowing preview for Turok 2. They really seem to think it's going to be something special. This page in N64 Magazine, back in September '98, is all about Turok 2, Seeds of Evil. It kicks off by saying the first game was alright, but GoldenEye kind of stole its thunder, but this sequel is supposed to be a proper step up. They're welcoming us to this roaring, snapping, staggering, ultra-violent world, which sounds a bit much, even for back then. The big headline is Turok, in a really bold, jungly font, with Seeds of Evil underneath. There's a close-up on a dinosaur eye with crosshairs on it, very dramatic. They've got a section called Visuals, and they're banging on about how they've cut back on the fog, which was a right pain in the first Turok, making it all misty and atmospheric, or at least that's what they told us at the time. Apparently now it's more of a fine mist, which is supposed to build expectancy and tension. Right, okay then. There are a couple of screenshots. One shows a deserted house with bodies on the floor. The reviewer notes it's nasty, which is putting it mildly for a Turok game. Another shows some jungly scene, and then one with a weapon on fire. They're going on about the interiors and exteriors being amazing and detailed, and that the level design is much better, not just samey corridors like the first game. Apparently the levels are massive now, and broken down into smaller bits so you don't get totally lost, which was a common issue back in the day. Interestingly, they point out Turok 2 only has one type of dinosaur, which seems a bit odd for a dinosaur hunting game, but apparently there are other monsters. Then there's a bit called Up the Screech talking about the sound. Apparently the background noise is just loads of screaming people and horses. They even quote some of the screams, "Oh my good" and "Ah!" Sounds charmingly over the top, doesn't it? They finish off by saying, "Oh, go on Iguana," which is the developer, I guess, kind of pushing them to make it even more gruesome. It also mentions the game is out in October, in both the US and the UK, and is for 1 to 4 players on the N64. So yeah, Turok 2, looking like a step up from the first one and promising to be properly violent, just what you'd expect. The next page in this issue then, is having a look at Turok 2, Seeds of Evil. It's all about the monsters really, isn't it? They're banging on about how scary they are, saying the dinosaurs are replaced by equally frightening creatures. Apparently these new beasties are intelligent too, which is a new spin, I suppose. They mention raptors that chase you, and some sort of flamethrower weapon to deal with them, setting them on fire. Charming. There are other monsters mentioned like Fireborn and Dromedons, all a bit gruesome sounding. It talks about level design being split into different sections and warps, giving it a vast feel, which sounds ambitious for the N64. Apparently every level now has a big end-of-stage boss, which they saw at E3. They describe one boss at the end of level 5 as a huge, pink, pulsating cocoon thing that spits out smaller mites. Sounds lovely. They also mention checkpoints being important, and to finish off enemies even when they're on the ground. Scheduled for October, they reckon it's looking amazing, and well, from the screenshots, it does look pretty decent for the old N64, doesn't it? Still a bit blocky, but you know, it's progress. This page is all about the weapons in the new Turok 2 game. It's called Death of the Day. Bit dramatic, isn't it? They're showing off 14 weapons in total, saying the first game only had half that, so double the firepower this time around apparently. They start with the Talon, which they say is your underwater weapon, but you'll ditch it for the spear gun soon enough. Then there's the Warblade. Sounds brutal, described as a two-pronged thing to take down raptors. The bow is next. Apparently arrows stick in monsters and they still come for you, even with an arrow in the head. The tech arrow is like the bow, but you can use it with the zoom mask. Warrington also has me. Moving on, we've got the pistol, your starting weapon, and it seems it's good for crimson fireworks, whatever that means, probably blood. The Magnum, they reckon you can take down a raptor with a couple of well-placed shots. Then there's the Tranquilizer, which is a bit different. It's for opening secret doors and keeping enemies in place. The Charged Dart Rifle stuns enemies with electricity apparently, while they are SH shaking. For the bigger stuff, there's the Shotgun, which is good for taking a raptor's head clean off. Lovely. The Plasma Rifle is like the Pulse Rifle from the first game, good for long range. Then the Firestorm Cannon, described as like the chain gun but juicier, whatever that means. Probably more explosions. The PFM Laser is a proximity mine thing that chops enemies in half if they wander near. Nice. PFOL. Lastly, there's the Grenade Launcher, back from the first game and good for launching grenades to high platforms. The Shredder is a new laser weapon that bounces off walls. Sounds a bit chaotic. The Scorpion Launcher fires 3 missiles. 1 homes in, 1 slices, and 1 scatters. Sounds like overkill. And finally, the Flamethrower, which fries enemies and can spread fire. Always fun. So yeah, that's the weapon rundown for Turok 2. Looks like they've gone all out on the arsenal this time. Expect a lot of GIBS, I suppose, if this is anything to go by. This page is a look at Turok 2. Seems like they are calling it a tour of the town. Bit of a daft title, innit? Right then, it's one of those step-by-step walkthroughs. showing you how to get through a bit of the game. They're saying Turok 2 is scary, well, moist brow scary apparently, which is a bit dramatic. They go on about the dark levels and monsters jumping out, typical magazine hype, but it was atmospheric to be fair. Back in '98 when this would have been knocking about. Looks like they are walking you through a dockland area to start with, then blowing up ships and going through sewers. Classic stuff really. Switches are a big deal apparently, opening up new bits of the level, always a bit of a puzzle to figure out where they all went. Then there's raptors jumping out at you of course, lots of shooting them with shotguns and tech arrows. Pretty standard Turok fare, big lizards and lots of gore. Then there's a bit about sniper mode, saying it's like MDK's sniper helmet, which was quite the thing at the time, MDK that is. Apparently you can zoom in and out and all that and shoot beasties from afar. Good old Turok 2, a bit of a blast from the past, wasn't it? This page then, from N64 Magazine, is having a good old look at Turok 2, Seeds of Evil. It seems they reckon it's shaping up to be a proper beast of a game, even saying it might be better than GoldenEye, which is fighting talk back then, innit? They're banging on about the graphics, saying the open areas are astonishing, and there's a fair bit of gore by the sounds of it. There are screenshots dotted around, showing off bits of the game. Looks like you're rescuing kids, which is a bit different. They're showing off some of the nasty creatures you'll be up against, these fireborn monsters, and later on they mention things like raptors and sloths, flesh-eaters, gants, and Perlin, and this bird bloke called Adon for multiplayer. Bit of a menagerie really. Weapons look suitably chunky, plasma rifles, firestorm cannons and flamethrowers, that kind of thing, proper lads' toys. Yeah, they're making a big deal about checkpoints, saying they're generous, which is always welcome, and these warp zones that sound a bit trippy. Right at the bottom they start talking about multiplayer modes, team mode, a deathmatch thing they're calling Bloodlust, and frag tag, which sounds like a right laugh. They're saying the multiplayer isn't in this preview, just mocked up screenshots. Cheeky. Loaded. Overall, they seem pretty chuffed with Turok 2, reckon it's going to be massive, and a reason to own an N64. They're even saying it's like Doom's all guns blazing action, which is high praise indeed. Sounds like they're well up for it, and we had to wait a bit longer to see the full review in the next issue. Standard mag stuff, teasing you to buy the next one. This page, right then, it's an N64 Arena page, from an old issue of N64 Magazine, good old N64 Arena. They're reviewing Mission Impossible for the N64. Bit of a dramatic headline there, world's first spy sim arrives. Bit much, even for the time, but alright. You've got a moody picture of Tom Cruise at the top, looking all sneaky. And yeah, there are some screenshots from the game itself underneath. Blocky as you'd expect for the N64 days, bless it. Below that, they've got their guide to scoring, explaining how they mark games. Remember the colours? Yellow for top marks, 85% and above. That's star game territory, the proper cream of the crop. Then blue for 8,470%. Still good games, jolly good fun. Green for 6,950%. Sort of average. Perfectly playable, but nothing special. Red is 4,920%, where you're getting into games that are a bit rubbish, lazily programmed and all that. And finally grey, 190%, the disaster zone, games they really didn't hold back on, telling you were awful. They make a point of saying they only give Star Game awards to games they've properly played through, to make sure you're getting your money's worth. Cartridges were pricey back then, weren't they? Basically, they're saying they take their reviews seriously and want to guide you to the good stuff, and away from the stinkers. Fair enough, I suppose. This page of N64 Magazine is having a look at import games, calling it Import Arena, seeing what's popular over in America and Japan. They've got a few titles listed. There's the bizarrely named Iggy's Wrecking Balls, WWF Warzone for the wrestling fans, and All-Star Baseball. Then they move on to F-Zero X, seems like a big deal this one. Star Soldier, Dizayman, and Off-Road Challenge are also there. Below that, they've got a How It Works section, explaining their review categories. Visuals, sounds, mastery and lifespan, with a final verdict. Fair enough, standard stuff for a game review really. They pose questions for each category to consider when reviewing, like, does the game have good graphics? For visuals, and is it worth the money? For lifespan, that kind of thing. Then there's Team 64, which must be their review team. Seems like F-Zero X is their game of the month. They've got comments from a bunch of them: James Hairboy Ashton, Will Overton, Tim Weaver, Martin Kitts, Paul Jarrell, Andrea Ball, Jess Bickham and James Price, all giving their little thoughts on F-Zero X and who they like to play as. Seems everyone on the team is pretty keen on F-Zero X this month then. This page is about the upcoming Mission Impossible game on the N64. It's clearly a preview, and they're pretty chuffed about getting their hands on a full version after a previous look in issue 15. They reckon they were right to be excited back then, as it was showing promise. It seems like they are comparing it to GoldenEye, saying this is more about stealth and less about just blasting everything, which was quite a big deal at the time. GoldenEye was the king of shooters back then, so being different was a point in its favor. They talk about sneaking around rooftops like you're some secret agent, and mention crouching through ventilation ducts, which sounds very spy movie-like. They also point out that the controls needed to be more precise for the stealth to really work, which is fair enough, and the camera was a bit dodgy in the preview versions they played. They do say the enemy AI needed some work too, being a bit unfair at times. But despite all that, they still thought it had potential. There's a little info box that says it's by Infogrames, due out in September, and will cost you £55. Madness! Games were expensive back then, and it needs a controller pack and rumble pack, so more expense. There are a few screenshots, one with a bloke in a suit, another with a tank. Typical game stuff really. They are clearly excited about getting their disguises on and infiltrating places, hinting at a stealthy experience, which was a bit different from the usual run-and-gun games we were used to. They call it the most delayed, and some would say most anticipated, game of 1998. Bit dramatic maybe, but it was a big film franchise, so I suppose there was hype for it. This page is all about the Mission Impossible game for the N64. It mentions the briefings you get from Jim Phelps before each mission, and the team you're lumbered with: Dieter, Candice, Clutter and Jack. Apparently, Candice is a liability, always getting shot, and messing up the missions, bless her. They're having a laugh at the expense of the villains, describing them as ugly bearded Russians, and completely inept Americans. Bit of a cliché, isn't it? The shooting mechanics are discussed, mentioning Ethan going translucent to go into first-person view by holding the right shoulder button, and you can strafe with the C buttons. Inventory is accessed with the B button, split into weapons and gadgets, standard fare for games back then. There are screenshots showing things like an air hostess handing Phelps a laptop, some cheesy dialogue with a James Bond line, and another highlighting Candice's, shall we say, less than stellar intelligence. Another screenshot shows using a guard security pass, and one about a silencer. Looks like it could be a decent enough game, typical spy action on the N64. This page is a walkthrough for the CIA rooftop level of Mission Impossible on the N64, calling it one of the best in the game with plenty of stealth. It's part of a larger section called This Could Be Levian, which is a bit of a rubbish title. In it mentions that the Impossible game is broken down into 5 missions: Ice Hit, Recover NOC List, Escape from CIA, Mole Hunt, and Ice Storm. They say the levels get harder as you go, even the sub-games, and warn you to be careful of objectives changing without warning. Apparently, they had to redo all 4 objectives on the sub-pen level after thinking they'd finished it. Cheeky! There's a section called A Wealth of Stealth, describing the sub-pen level in 2 parts. Part 1 talks about arriving at a high-security area dropped off by Dieter, and you're jumping over fences. You're supposed to knock out a guard, nick his face with the facemaker tool, and pick up a letter. The point being, by getting a guard to deliver the letter for you, you have time to leap onto the back of a truck. Handy. Moving on. The screenshot shows a guard asking, "Can you take this letter to the subpen for me?" Cool. Below that it says, "He'll deliver it alright. He'll deliver it, or we won't spare his sorry life." Ahaha. Which is a bit dramatic, even for then. Part 2 of the subpen walkthrough is about arriving under cover of darkness and having to pick up an explosive. You gotta watch out for searchlights, and if you get spotted, loads of guards appear and gun you down. They suggest shooting out the lights on the search towers to wander around unchallenged, and then leap on the back of the carrier. The screenshot shows a guard being taken down, and then a picture of the carrier truck, with the objective: get a guard to deliver your letter, and leap onto the back of this carrier. The main walkthrough for the rooftop level is in 4 steps with pictures. Step 1 is about being dropped behind crates, and needing to be careful not to wander into the line of sight of guards. Step 2 says you could dispatch the guards with your dart gun, but have to be quick. Step 3 is about finding a generator to shut down helipad lights, because they are protected by an electric floor. Step 4 is once the lights flicker out, a government helicopter is waiting, and you need to delay it by shutting these lights down so they don't see the helipad. Classic Mission Impossible stuff really, lots of sneaking about, good times, good times. This page is about Blimey Mission Impossible on the N64, remember that one? So walkthrough bit, looks like they're on about the embassy level, then security hallway, and CIA headquarters. Right then, embassy bit, they're saying it's complicated because of some woman in a red dress, a contract killer apparently. Sounds a bit dramatic, doesn't it? You gotta lure her into the toilets, knock her out, All a bit sneaky. Then it's on to disguising yourself as the ambassador's aide. Very 007, isn't it? Next up is the security hallway, where apparently if you've gone all guns blazing, well that's a choice, but risky. They mention protecting Candice, who's a computer expert, and getting the NOC list. Dart gun is the weapon of choice here, quieter than a revolver they reckon, like GoldenEye, proper classic that was, psumi. Then finally, CIA headquarters. Loads of guards with tear gas and shotguns, blimey. CCTV cameras too, so you gotta spray paint the lenses, clever trick that. Bit of GoldenEye inspiration again I reckon. Dart gun again is the way to go to take out the guards. Looks like classic stealth gameplay from back then, all a bit blocky and lowers now, but we thought it was amazing at the time, didn't we? Good memories. This page is from an old issue of N64 Magazine, and it's doing a walkthrough for Mission Impossible on the N64, right in the middle of the mag. Looks like they're taking you through a section of the game step by step. First up, they're telling you to get past a helicopter and plant a signal scrambler, classic spy stuff, to stop it taking off. Then it's all about getting a security pass to get into the terminal room. Looks like there are some laser beams to dodge as well, using a laser protractor mind you, a bit fiddly those gadgets. Then in the embassy warehouse you have to shoot a guard while disguised as someone else, naturally. And finally, a bit of a sneaky camera trick to get a keypad code, setting up a digital camera to film it while a guard types it in. Bit of alright that. There's a bit of a review section squeezed in as well, and they are not holding back, are they? Basically saying that after all the hype and with GoldenEye and Metal Gear Solid being released around the same time, Mission Impossible was a bit of a letdown. Apparently even if it had come out earlier it wouldn't have been amazing. They're slating the AI, the animation, the camera work, the lot. Unfair AI they reckon, and just general dodgy controls. Basically it sounds like they're saying it's not a patch on GoldenEye or Metal Gear Solid, which, let's be honest, were in a different league at the time, weren't they? Ah well, can't win them all. This page in N64 Arena magazine is having a look at Mission Impossible on the N64. Right then, Mission Impossible. I remember the hype for this one. So the reviewer, Tim Weaver, seems a bit on the fence if I'm honest. He's talking about the ideas in the game being fantastic, like spraying paint on CCTV cameras, dodging searchlights and disguising yourself. Sounds a bit like a spy sim, which was the idea I suppose. He says it feels like a spy sim, but then he slams the execution as lackluster. Typical N64 game sometimes, great ideas, a bit ropey in practice. He's moaning about how difficult and frustrating it is to play, saying it's all trial and error and you keep dying and having to start the mission again. Sounds about right for the time, didn't they all seem to want to be super hard back then? And he's having a pop at the controls and aiming, saying you can't shoot someone if they are too far away even if you've got them locked on. Annoying, but again not unheard of. He does mention the mastery aspects are good, saying the AI is one of the N64's strongest points, despite Mission, the game itself, not looking much from the screenshots. Bit of a backhanded compliment there. Warrington, visually he says the screenshots are nice and static, but the animation is disappointing when things move. Again standard N64 stuff really. Sounds are okay, loads of sampled speech, and the theme tune, but the speech sounds a bit fast. Warrington knew. Lifespan is hard, and sometimes quite engrossing apparently, so if you stick with it there's plenty to do. But then he sums it all up in the verdict, saying it's promising, but heavy on faults, and occasionally shabby. Ouch. He gives it 75%, which isn't terrible, but not amazing either. He does say the sequel has a lot of work to do. So, a bit of a mixed bag then. Remember wanting to play this, the film was massive, but maybe Perfect Dark ended up being the better spy game on the N64 in the end. This page in N64 Magazine issue 19 has a look at Acclaim's new game, Iggy's Wrecking Balls. It's billed as a racing game without corners, which is a bit of a head-scratcher, isn't it? Apparently it's trying to muscle in on the Mario Kart and Diddy Kong racing territory but with a puzzle element, and supposedly over 100 courses. The reviewer seems a bit skeptical, mentioning it might be for best time trial competition, or maybe not. The screenshots show these weird spherical characters, the wrecking balls I suppose, navigating these twisty-turny tracks that do look a bit like roller coaster rides. There's talk of grappling hooks and climbing these courses, which sounds a bit different to just pure racing. They mention characters like QT, a Baby Spice hybrid, and Sunny, who is a meth-swilling down-out. Bit harsh, but it's the 90s, eh? Then there's Chatter, described as rejected dentures from Clay Fighter, and of course, Iggy himself, who's apparently so ugly he makes babies cry. charming bunch. The game is described as set over 2 or 3 laps on these rollercoaster platform tracks. You have to grapple your way up and land on a checkered finish to move to the next lap. Sounds a bit fiddly to be honest, but they say there are 3 other computer-controlled balls to race against. The game is coming out in August, costs £40, and it's for 14 players. Controller pack and rumble pack are compatible, and it takes up 3 pages in the magazine, which is quite a bit of coverage. Might be one to keep an eye on, or maybe just a bit of a weird one, we'll have to see. This page is about the battle mode in Iggy's Wrecking Balls. It's calling it a cute racing game, which is a bit generous for how odd it looked. It's like Mario Kart but with bouncing balls instead of go-karts and grappling hooks, which sounds alright on paper I suppose. Apparently the battle mode is a bit naff though. If someone runs away you're stuck bouncing after them in a straight line, which does sound pretty tedious. They reckon the game is random and confusing, and you probably won't want to bother with it. There are some little screenshots showing the battle mode in action, with these blobby characters floating around platforms, and power-ups scattered about. One screenshot even points out a purple blob character hanging off a platform like a mutated umbilical cord. Charming. Another one shows a bomb mode if you lose badly enough. There's a section called Secrets, suggesting if you can be bothered to play for long enough, Iggy will reward you with extra characters, and apparently, there are hidden question mark boxes on the player select screen, promising more horrors. Not exactly selling it, are they? The mastery bit says the tracks are split into 10 environments to add variety, but they still look pretty samey. They say later levels add hazards and enemies like moving lifts, which sounds about as exciting as watching paint dry. The review scores it on visuals, sounds, mastery, lifespan and verdicts. Visually they say it's technically okay, but only a mother could love the faces. Sounds are apparently what you'd expect, dude. Mastery gets a 4, saying a racing game without corners shouldn't work, and they are right, it doesn't. Lifespan gets a 5, only for completists who want to see every course. And the overall verdict is a try before you buy type of game, and a frighteningly ugly one at that, and gives it a 56%. Ouch. So basically, it sounds like a bit of a stinker really, even for back then when we were maybe a bit more forgiving. This page is all about WWF Warzone on the N64. Looks like a bit of a preview or review. They're laying it on thick about the wrestlers being larger than life, saying they're big, fat, and earning a fortune, but also acknowledging it's the N64's best wrestling game at the time. There are screenshots showing wrestlers like The Undertaker, Shawn Michaels, Goldust looking a bit blocky, bless them, and Farouk, or is it Ron Simmons from back in the day? One of the captions is having a bit of a dig, calling Goldust large, ugly and fat as a bus, and joking that his face isn't a mask. Another caption mentions All Out War, or US version of Come Dancing, as the most popular things on cable in America. They're going on about the appeal of wrestling games, the drama and the dreams of being a champion, even if you don't have the blonde mullet. Sounds like a bit of fun but not taking itself too seriously, typical Games Mag stuff from back then. This page is about the WWF Warzone game on the N64, and it's all about creating your own wrestler, like proper customization, not just picking from a roster. They're saying it's almost as much fun messing about making your character as it is actually playing the game. Which sounds about right. Remember spending ages tweaking stats in games back then. It talks about loads of options, clothing, and even personality and theme tunes. Proper in-depth stuff for the time. They mention you can make colourful, crazy-looking wrestlers, as well as more realistic ones. There's a bit about some bloke called Will, taking out his frustrations on someone called Shigsy in the game, because of Zelda delays, always blaming Zelda for something back then, wasn't it? There's a bit in a box about the game details, like it's out on the 23rd of August, costs £50, and needs a controller pack and rumble pack naturally. It's a 1 to 4 player game. Yay. Recao. Looking at the screenshots, you've got your wrestler creation screens, showing off accessories, names, and body types. Then there are some in-game shots of these custom wrestlers, Overspong and Shigsy, having a right old ding-dong in the ring. One bit says check out the pecs on Will, and gulp. Doesn't look like Shigsy stands a chance here, which is a bit of banter. Another screenshot says, Shigsy's in no mood for the battle, and, but our boy won't be denied, and then total blowout. You can bet Nintendo will never again delay an RPG. Bit harsh on Nintendo, but that's magazines for you. It ends with, Will Overspong wins by total blowout. So it's all a bit of a laugh, showing off the custom wrestler feature, and a match between these two they made. Then there's a bit about the pain meter, making wrestlers squeal like a little piggy. Charming. Another screenshot has Steve Austin about to do something nasty, with a 32-inch Trinitron to Kane. Sounds painful. And another one, with The Rock doing something unpleasant to Mosh. And lastly, you can apparently take the fight outside the ring for extra realism. All in all, it's making Warzone sound like a decent bit of wrestling fun, with a good character creator. This page from N64 Magazine is taking a look at the wrestling game, WWF Warzone. They're wondering what pigeonhole wrestling games even fit in, saying they're not quite sports games, but everyone still buys them. They reckon Warzone is a proper looker on the N64, especially compared to older wrestling games on the SNES like WCW vs NWO, and Tokon Road, saying the graphics are pin sharp and the wrestlers look chunky in a good way. Apparently the game has loads of different match types to keep you busy: Royal Rumble, cage matches, weapon fights, tag teams, and even a training mode to learn all the moves. The screenshots show off some wrestlers like Kane, Goldust, Shamrock, Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, the Gimp, Thrasher and The Rock, getting down to business in the ring. Bit blocky looking now, but we thought it was amazing at the time, didn't we? This page from N64 Magazine takes you right back to September '98, doesn't it? It's a review of WWF Warzone for the N64. See those blocky screenshots of wrestlers like Triple H, The Rock and Mankind? They really were pushing the boat out with 3D graphics back then, even if they look a bit rough now. Warrington Norku. The reviewer, Martin Kitts, reckons it's a step up from the old SNES wrestling games, faster paced and easier to get into than those complicated WCW ones. They mention the sound is decent, with the crowd getting into it, and the visuals are alright, smooth enough even if a bit chunky. Apparently the gameplay is simple to pick up, which was probably a good thing, as some wrestling games could be a right faff to control. They talk about the little old ladies in the crowd, which is a bit of a weird thing to focus on, and they liked the commentary. But it sounds like it can get a bit samey on your own, but with mates in multiplayer, it's a right laugh. They give it a solid 85%, reckon it's not perfect but good fun for a multiplayer session. Yeah, Warzone, it was alright for its time, a decent wrestling game to have a bit of a rumble with your mates on the N64. This page has a review of All-Star Baseball for the N64, looks like issue 19 of N64 Magazine. Right then, baseball on the Nintendo 64, not exactly a massive sport over here, but still, always interesting to see what the Yanks are playing. Quarantine. They're giving it a pretty decent 84% overall. Visually, it's getting a 9, which they say is astonishing, though looking at the screenshots, it's alright for the time I suppose. Bit blocky as you'd expect. Sound gets a 5. Bit of a mixed bag it seems, with a comatose crowd. Mastery and lifespan both get an 8, so it sounds like it's easy to pick up but has some depth, and plenty to keep you going. Apparently you can create your own players, and the reviewer is having a laugh at the names you can give them, like Eddie Saggy Dog or Frank DeMan Franklin. Bit silly, but that was the style back then, wasn't it? They reckon the creative player is good, but not as good as Iguana's WWF Warzone, which is a bit of a left field comparison. Maybe they just liked wrestling games. The reviewer, Tim Weaver, seems quite impressed with the visuals, calling them the main draw and mentioning the details like the stadiums and player animations. He thinks it's more of a simulation than MLB. Slower paced but more realistic. Says it's got a clever pitching system and the Rumble Pack even warns you if you're aiming outside the strike zone. Fancy that. Says it's a good baseball game for the N64 if you're into that sort of thing. Warrington Norther. Even Warrington Norther. At the top there's a little box with the details. All-Star Baseball by Acclaim. 96 megabytes on the cartridge. Works with the controller pack for saving 15 pages of data, and Rumble Pack support of course. Price is £40, which was a fair whack back then for a new game. Out now apparently, so it must have been hitting the shelves around the time this magazine came out. Yeah, seems like a solid enough review for a baseball game, if you were keen on your American sports on the N64. This page is from N64 Magazine, issue 19, and it's all about F-Zero X. It's part of the Import Arena section, because back then these games often came out in Japan and the US first. They're flagging up that the reviews from this point onwards in the magazine will be focused on games from those regions initially. Sihasja. The big image is classic F-Zero stuff. You've got Captain Falcon front and center along with some of the other racers. They're reminiscing about the original F-Zero on the SNES, saying it was the ideal racer and a bankable name for Nintendo. They were obviously pleased to get an N64 version, though there was some question if it could live up to the hype. Tawai. The article goes on about the speed of F-Zero X. They reckon Nintendo were trying something different with the graphics, and the F-Zero X is like a tech demo for speed, claiming it's the fastest console game ever, hitting like 1,700 kilometers per hour. The writer wonders if they've sacrificed gameplay for speed, and if it'll be as good as Wipeout 64, which was the benchmark for slick futuristic racers on the N64 at the time. They end by saying it's going to be a controversial game on the N64, and to read on for more. So typical preview stuff, building anticipation, and raising a few questions about whether it's going to be any good. This page is all about F-Zero X on the N64. It's titled Import Arena F-Zero X, so this must be a review of the Japanese version, considering it was September '98. Right at the top, it mentions there are no language options, but it's easy enough to figure out. They run through the game modes. Grand Prix is the main one, racing through cups like Jack, Queen, King and Joker. Apparently Joker Cup only shows up after you beat the others on Standard, and there's Beginner, Standard, Expert difficulty settings to get through. Then they reckon there might even be a super hard difficulty after Expert. Sounds a right challenge. Time attack is mentioned as becoming important later, good for improving your lap times. Death Race sounds brutal, just eliminating opponents. Practice mode is there to get you ready for Grand Prix. Versus is the multiplayer mode, 2 to 4 players, standard split screen stuff, mentions Mario Kart style. Options are fairly simple. CPU car number. Whether you have CPU cars in multiplayer, stereo or mono sound. Fair enough. Quarrington Norsa. There's a bit about goggles down, talking about the 4 camera views, all chase cam style, not in-car views, which was pretty standard back then. They joke about the 4th view being so far back, it's almost pointless. Maybe Nintendo were having a laugh. There's a button-up section that details the controls. Analog stick for steering, A for accelerate, B for boost after the first lap, bottom C for air brake, Z for bank left, R for bank right, top C for glance back and right C for change view. Attacks are double tap Z for barge left, double tap R for barge right, and hold Z double tap T, or vice versa for spin attack. Simple enough, but mastering them is the key. They say it's not a simple game to learn. Finally, there's a little info box. Out now in Japan, 128 meg. Supports the controller pack for save games and Rumble pack for Rumble. 14 players. Mentions it was out in August in the US, and coming in November for the UK. Priced around £35. Yeah, that sounds about right for a new N64 game at the time. Good to know when we might actually get our hands on it over here. Looks like a fast and frantic racer. Might be worth importing if you're impatient. This page from N64 Magazine issue 19 takes a look at the Jack Cup in F-Zero Xi for the N64. It's not a full review as such, more of a track-by-track rundown giving you a heads up on each of the 6 tracks in the Cup. First up is Mute City, described as wider than a football pitch and fast seems about right for F-Zero. They reckon you need to hit all the boost chevrons and boost like mad over the loop-the-loop. Classic F-Zero really. Then there's Silence, which they say is an enormous oval, all about speed. Apparently, hitting 8 boost chevrons in a row can get you to 1,600 km per hour, which is properly rapid, even by F-Zero standards. They suggest picking a powerful craft for this one, Worry. Track 3 is Sand Ocean, which introduces tunnels and a lack of gravity. Sounds like the sort of track where you'll be bouncing off the walls if you're not careful. They warn about losing control in the tunnels. Good advice that, Gia. Devil's Forest is next, with long straights for speed but also sand strips to slow you down. They suggest boosting carefully to avoid losing contact with the track. Tricky. Track 5 is Big Blue, mostly a winding tube they say. You're advised to stay on the inside of corners for top speed and boost on the outside, or you'll fly off to your death. Cheerful stuff. Ray. Finally there's Port Town, which starts narrow and has a big jump at the end of the lap. They suggest using your analog stick for a clean landing. You'd hope so. The page finishes by saying if you win the Jack Cup, you get a rather lame winning cutscene, and that the fireworks afterwards are, in the words of Tim, dump. Always good to keep expectations managed, eh? Looking back, these previews were always a good way to get the early lowdown on games, even if they weren't always the most in-depth. Still, got you hyped up though, didn't it? The next page in this mag is all about the Queen Cup in F-Zero X. It seems things are starting to get a bit trickier now, with proper scary tracks. Track 1, Sector Alpha, they say it's named because it throws your ship all over the place. Apparently you're cruising along nicely until suddenly the track narrows to basically 1 car width, which sounds a bit hairy. Worry. Track 2 is Red Canyon. If you thought there wasn't much room to maneuver before, Red Canyon seems to ramp that up with loads of jumps into tight corners, with chevrons for extra measure. They reckon it's a real test for the lads. Track 3, Devil's Forest 2, sounds ominous. They're saying if you're daft enough to boost on the long straight here, you'll just fly right off the track and that's game over. Bit harsh. Track 4, Mute City 2, is taking us through city streets. Sort of. It's got a bump jump that sends your ship straight up. Not much use now they reckon, but apparently later it will be. Intriguing. Track 5 is Big Blue 2. This one is where the track loses its edges, so falling off the side becomes a real possibility. They're warning us to watch out for the chevrons before the sideless banking turn. Sounds like a proper white-knuckle ride. Track 6, Whiteland, keeps the no edges theme going. This one they say is perfect for fighting, with narrow sideless bits for barging people off and stepped vertical jumps for spin attacking opponents. Sounds like multiplayer carnage. Error. There's a bit about fight for life, talking about attacking moves. Apparently, on the easier difficulties you can get away without bothering, but ramp it up, and you'll be facing 29 ships wanting a piece of you. They mention barging opponents sideways, and the spin attack for narrow bits. If you win the Queen Cup on standard difficulty you get another 6 cars to choose from, which is a decent reward I suppose. There's a machine select screen showing all the cars you can pick. Good stuff. This page from N64 Magazine, bless it, is taking a look at the King Cup in F0X. F0X. Now that was a proper racer, wasn't it? They're saying this cup is where things get a bit hairy, mentioning you might start losing lives and getting bumped off by other racers, or even the track itself. Bit dramatic, but fair enough, it could get a bit frantic. Hairy. Track 1 is Firefield. Apparently it's all about one big jump over a chicane. They reckon light ships will clear it, heavier ones might end up in the danger zone. Sounds about right. Risk versus reward. That's F0. Next up is Silence 2, which is described as a sideless track, and good for multiplayer and fast driving. They're suggesting using the R and Z buttons through the chicane to keep it tight and straight. Good tip actually, might have needed that back in the day. Track 3, Sector Beta. Sounds a bit nasty. They say it's got reverse camber and no sides. Lovely. Apparently it's easy to get spun out in a light ship. They recommend staying in the center. Cheers for the advice, lads. Red Canyon 2, Track 4, is all about twists and turns, and they're warning about getting boost happy and coming unstuck. Like the namesake apparently, meaning the original Red Canyon from the first game I suppose. Tricky corners and boosts not mixing well, classic F-Zero. At Track 5, Whiteland 2, is compared to tunnels in Sand Ocean, but riskier. If you flip too much, you're off for good. Sounds like a white knuckle ride. And they say the boost chevrons are for the brave. Probably best to keep it steady then, unless you're feeling flash. Finally, Track 6 is Mute City 3, one of the finest tracks they reckon, and good for shortcuts. Bump jumps are placed to chuck you in the air to cut corners apparently. Combine boosts and mid-air steering to chop off miles. Sounds like the sort of shortcut that could go horribly wrong just as easily. But hey, that's the thrill, isn't it? One of five. There's a little winner section at the bottom saying beat King Cup on standard difficulty, and you unlock another 6 cars. Right, good to know. And below that, it mentions Machine Select with 18 cars to choose from now. They still rate Jodie's machine, even with all those options. Always liked Jodie Summer. Good choice. Oh, and at the top left there's a bit about fair play, talking about Mario Kart on the SNES. They're having a moan about the CPU always keeping up with you, no matter how well you raced. Bit of a cheat really. They reckon N64 Magazine understood why it was done, kept races interesting and all that, but it annoyed a lot of people. Yeah, tell me about it. Who hasn't felt the frustration of a blue shell just as you're about to win? Good old days mostly. This page in the magazine is all about the Joker Cup in F0X. Blimey, that game was fast, wasn't it? It's showing off the tracks from this hidden cup. You had to unlock it on standard difficulty apparently. First up is Rainbow Road, which they say is how it should have been in Mario Kart. Cheeky. Apparently the shortcut doesn't work, so no cheating on this version then. Decent. Next up is Devil's Forest 3, a back-to-back track. Sounds a bit disorientating, and they're saying you can watch opponents above and behind. How odd. They reckon the short straights are good for boosting, but watch out for the sides. Icky. Roo. Then there's Space Plant, narrow twisty bits and another one of those magnetic tubes. They mention ice sections which cause them a few problems. Tricky. But Track 4 is Sand Ocean 2, described as a really fast track, with undulations that can throw you off. They warn about your top speed. Sounds like you need to be careful boosting. Port Town 2 is next, a narrow track, only wide enough for 2 ships, with multi-car pile-ups likely. They say there are power-up strips a quarter of the way round, so grab them quick. Wah! Finally, there's Big Hand, which sounds terrifying. Hairpin bends and no sides for most of it, plus ice down the middle of the road. Best for fear, it says in a big red circle. Charming. They reckon you shouldn't even try turning on the ice. There's also a bit about death racing, which they say is the dullest part of F0X, just endless loops of track and trying to bump off opponents. They compare it to Wipeout, but say it's more subtle, whatever that means. Oh, and right at the bottom it mentions you can unlock more cars, including Fox's dad, James McLeod, by beating the Queen Cup on Expert. James McLeod, now that's a name I've not heard in a while. Bit of Star Fox link there. This page is all about F0X, right in the middle of the N64's life. It's got a big game on, splashed across the top, which is fairly standard magazine fare, And then a slightly more thoughtful bit called Mastery, F-Zero is interfering with your mind. Sounds a bit dramatic, doesn't it? They're banging on about how Nintendo might have failed a bit with multiplayer games before, but F-Zero X is supposed to be a proper laugh. Unlike Lilac Wars apparently, which they say was a bit boring in multiplayer. They reckon F-Zero X is a good mix of Mario Kart and Diddy Kong Racing, praising the close racing and combat, which is fair enough, it could get pretty hectic. They're talking about proper 4-player races on one telly screen, which was always a bit of a squash, but good fun with mates. Capri. There are some screen grabs showing the game in action, with little comments underneath like, the tense starting line face-off, smell the fear, and player one's gone for a Burton already. Martin probably. Very witty, as usual for these mags back then. They point out that the in-car view is a bit basic, no fancy interiors or anything, like no heater or CD player, because apparently it's all about saving processing power for the speed. Makes sense, I suppose, when you're going at those ridiculous speeds in F-Zero. The mastery bit is interesting. They're saying the game is so intense you get completely focused on the track, to the point where you don't even notice what's around you in real life. Bit much maybe, but it is fast, very fast. They even suggest you get up and walk around after playing to see how much it messed with your head, which is a bit of an odd thing to suggest in a games mag, but there you go. They mention there are 29 other racers on track, and it's all about surviving and staying focused. And yeah, getting a good time was all about not losing speed and mastering the corners. Good times, fast game, bit intense maybe according to them. This page from the N64 mag is having a look at F-Zero X. Seems like a proper deep dive into the game. They are calling this article the Ghost Road, which is a bit dramatic, but I guess it's about the ghost racing feature. Apparently if you had any doubts about F-Zero being a serious racer, this game will sort them out. They reckon the handling is really precise, proper analog control, and the difference between a good and perfect lap can be massive, like 10 seconds. They mention ghosts to help you improve your times, storing up to 4 of them so you can race against yourself, which is pretty neat. Barry Lyndon is talking about the GP races, and how in championship mode, the ship nearest to you, or the leader if you are falling behind, is labelled rival. He says it's like fighting Michael Schumacher, which is a bit much, but I get what he means, adding some drama to the races. Good point he makes about the CPU being proper aggressive. Fighting dirty is the only way to win sometimes, which sounds about right from back in the day with these types of games. Warrington Norcus. Visually they call it smooth but a bit bland, which is fair enough for the time. Polygons weren't everything. Sounds are good apparently, with a funny mention of Japanese Iron Maiden, whatever that means. Mastery and lifespan get top marks, saying it's better than most races, and has excellent replayability, especially with multiplayer and time attack, which is probably true, we rinsed these games back then. The verdict is a stonking 91%, calling it a brilliant successor, and the best straight racer on the N64, the fastest thing on Silicon, which is high praise indeed. Accessibility is mentioned, saying there is some Japanese text, but nothing to worry about. There's a screenshot of Rainbow Road being mentioned as a tough track, and they compare the difficulty to Mario Kart but harder, especially some of the later tracks and Joker Cup. Overall, James Ashton seems really impressed, calling it fantastic, and the greatest pure racing game on the N64. Good stuff. This page is all about the return of proper shoot-'em-ups, or shmups, as we used to call them back in the day. Seems like the magazine reckons they're making a comeback, which is fair enough, they were everywhere in the arcades and on the SNES and Mega Drive, weren't they? The main game they're banging on about is Star Soldier S for the N64. Which is fair enough, they were. Looks like a futuristic 2D shooter, which is a bit of a throwback considering all the 3D stuff coming out on the N64 at the time. They mention it's like the older Star Soldier games, which were pretty popular on the NES and SNES. Vertically scrolling, loads of power-ups, big bosses, the usual stuff. They say there are 6 levels and a final boss, and you can pick from 3 different ships. Apparently the controls are easy enough to pick up if you've played any shmups before, especially if you've used an analog stick, which is a bit different for this kind of game. Or, there are a few screenshots, one of a massive robot boss, another with some kind of watery level, and one with a sort of space background. Nothing too mind-blowing graphics-wise, but it looks alright for what it is. One of the captions mentions something big and mean at the end of each level, which is hardly surprising in a game like this. Another one talks about yellow blobs powering up your weapon, again standard SHMUP fare really. They've got a little box out with the game info, saying it's out now in Japan and coming soon in the UK. Probably gonna cost about 35 quid. Seems like you need a controller pack and rumble pack, typical N64 extras. Overall they seem cautiously optimistic about it, not exactly raving but saying it's a decent old school style shooter. We'll see if it actually kicks off a SHMUP revival, won't we? The next page here is a look at Star Soldier on the N64, right in the Import Arena section. It's got a big blue title, OLDIER, a bit cheeky, as it is a bit of a retro throwback. They're letting you choose your weapon up top, showing off 3 ships, Vanadium, Wisteria, and Lathyrus. Vanadium is for beginners apparently, with a Vulcan cannon and firebomb. Wisteria is the tank of the group, packing a wave gun and GB bomb. Sounds beefy but slow. Then there's Lathyrus, the fancy one for the connoisseur, with a laser gun and mega laser. Sounds like the flashy option. Looking at the review itself, it seems a bit lukewarm. They're saying Hudson, who made it, could have done more to make it look impressive for the N64. Reckon it looks a bit like a SNES game but in higher resolution. They do admit the bosses, the manga robots, are alright. It sounds like they think it's a bit samey and stuck in the past, not really pushing the boat out for a 2D shooter on the N64. The mastery box is interesting. It's saying if you've played Super R-Type or Axelay, you'll find the first couple of difficulty levels a doddle. They did get to the M boss on standard in an hour, so maybe it's not a massive challenge for seasoned SHMUP fans. The verdict is a 62% fun for a 15-minute blast, but it's relying on the score challenge to keep you going if you're a proper Super Aleste sort of player. The little side boxes give scores out of 10 for different bits. Visuals is down as smooth and busy, but disappointingly unspectacular. Sounds gets a Japanese synth rock all round and loads of zingy zappy noises. Which is what you'd expect really, isn't it? Mastery just says, you have to be kidding, right? Bit sarcastic that. And Lifespan is about getting to grips with the combo system and the caravan mode. Accessibility says it's all in English, which is a bonus if you're not fluent in Japanese imports, obviously. So overall, sounds like a decent enough retro blast for a bit, but not exactly setting the world on fire. This page is all about Dezemon on the N64, and it's being pitched as the hardest game in the world. Bit dramatic, innit? Turns out, it's not really a game in the traditional sense, but more of a tool to make your own shmups. They're saying if you thought N64 graphics were dodgy back in the day, then you've clearly not seen what you could bodge together with this. Turns out, apparently this Japanese import lets you create your own shoot'em-ups from scratch. They reckon it's like a souped UP version of those old paint programs but for making games. You can draw your own spaceships, create levels, even compose music using some kind of music editor. And they mentioned you can even try to make polygon models if you're feeling brave, though it sounds a bit tricky. The reviewer had a go, and whipped up a couple of examples called Solid Gear and Usagi-chan in Cutesy Pop and Twinbee Affair. Sounds a bit bonkers, doesn't it? They even drew a little smiley face in the editor, which they thought looked pathetic when they put it in the game. They're saying it's got English menus, which is a bonus for a spritz, but you'll need to get your nose in the manual to figure it all out. Marby. They gave it a pretty decent score of 82%. Reckon it's a top idea and something different for the N64. Mastery got a 7, and Lifespan an 8. Basically, if you've got loads of time, and a bit of artistic talent, you could get lost in this thing. They even said if they ever got their hands on an English instruction manual, they'd be playing nothing else. Bit strong maybe, but it sounds like it's got potential, especially the music editor bit they seemed keen on. Think they were joking about making the next Banjo soundtrack though. This page right then is a review of Off-Road Challenge for the N64. Looking at it now, blimey, 64 megabit cartridge. That was something back then. The reviewer seems a bit underwhelmed, calling it my first computer game type of thing. Apparently, it's about racing 4x4s on off-road tracks, and you collect cash and upgrade your truck. Visually, they're not impressed, saying it's like a Glastonbury toilet tent, and technically basic too, like a short length of wood. Ouch. They mention the sprites are flat and look a bit naff, and the power-ups are hard to tell apart. The tracks sound a bit dodgy as well, with scenery popping in too close. They also mention V-Rally coming out and suggesting people should be calm and wait for that instead. Sounds like Off-Road Challenge isn't going to be a classic then. There's a bit about two-player being rubbish, and something about jumping to avoid holes. Sometimes it works, sometimes not. They even had quality control issues at midway apparently, which is a bit of a worry. The reviewer, James Ashton, is having a proper go at it, saying if you try hard enough, you can almost pretend the game never happened. Bit harsh, mate. They've given it a right stinker of a score, 21% in the verdict section, saying it makes you pray for a power cut. Visuals and sounds get a measly 2 out of 5, Mastery gets a 0, and Lifespan gets a 1 with a load of beep beep noises. Not exactly selling it, are they? There are some cheat codes listed for extra tracks, LK Jean and Flagstaff, and also for monster trucks like Punisher, 4x4 Monster, Thunderbolt, and the Crusher. Still, doesn't sound like it's worth bothering with even if you use cheats. Oh well, plenty of other games out there, wasn't there? This page is all about Banjo-Kazooie, right on the cover, saying, how to find absolutely everything. and paste Gruntilda. Cheeky. Seems like they're promising to reveal all the secrets in Banjo-Kazooie inside, which was a pretty big deal back then. You've got Banjo and Kazooie plastered all over it looking a bit goofy, and old Gruntilda looking as menacing as ever at the bottom with a few other characters from the game like Mumbo Jumbo and Bottles. Classic N64 era stuff, good times. Says September 1998 at the bottom, so this is when everyone was properly getting stuck into Banjo for the first time. Daniel Glenfield's name is on there too, probably the writer. Seems like a guide to get you through the game and find all those jiggies and musical notes they were always banging on about. This page here is a proper retro throwback, innit? It's all about Banjo-Kazooie from N64 Magazine, must be issue 19. Right at the top it's saying they had a 14-page review of Banjo in the last issue, issue 18. Blimey, 14 pages, they really went all out for that one. Says it got a mighty 92% overall, only GoldenEye 007 got a higher score. Which is fair enough, GoldenEye was brilliant, wasn't it? If you wanted to know what all the fuss was about with Banjo, you could order a back issue, cheeky. Then it gets into the guide for Banjo-Kazooie itself, calling it the definitive guide. Bit dramatic, but hey, it's a guide. They were clearly burning the midnight oil, fueled by thousands of gallons of strong black coffee, to get this thing together, bless 'em. They reckon they've crammed in the locations of every skull, jiggy and extra life. Ambitious. The guide kicks off with the training area, which of course in Banjo is where you meet Bottles, that mole fella. It tells you to talk to Bottles at each of his 8 molehills. Then lists where to find him, like outside Banjo's house, by the tree trunks, on top of Spiral Mountain, that sort of thing. Just general places to find him dotted around the first area, to learn the basics. Me. Next up is honeycombs. You have to collect all of these to get an extra life hexagon. It lists a few places they are, like on a tree trunk, above the tree before the bridge, underwater, and using the beak barge on the large rocks. Standard collectathon stuff really, wasn't it? And lastly in this section is extra lives. Apparently there's one on top of Banjo's house, and another inside the waterfall. Always hidden in plain sight, those extra lives, weren't they? Down the side there's a contents bit, listing all the areas this guide is going to cover, starting with the training area on page 68, then the lair, Mumbo's Mountain, Treasure Trove Cove, Clanker's Cavern, Bubblegloop Swamp, Gobi's Valley, Freezy Peak, Mad Monster Mansion, Rusty Bucket Bay, Click Clock Wood, and finally Gruntilda's bit at the end, page 88. So yeah, a full guide to the whole game. By the looks of it. Pretty comprehensive for back in '98, when the internet wasn't quite the how-to-solve-everything machine it is now. This page from N64 Magazine, harking back to September '98, seems to be dishing out some top tips for Banjo-Kazooie. It's all about finding the collectibles in Gruntilda's lair, you know, the usual platform game shenanigans back then. So first up we have jigsaws, or jiggies as we probably called them. And it's giving you a nudge on where to find them. Things like hitting switches to make them appear, standard stuff really. It mentions looking on the left as you enter, above Mumbo's Mountain, and using the termite, which I suppose is the grenade egg, wasn't it? Then there's one on the pirate ship in Treasure Trove Cove using the beakbuster on Gruntilda's eyes in Clanker's Cavern, behind the Gruntilda statue in Bubblegloop Swamp, above the entrance to Freezy Peak, inside the mummy's tomb in Gobi's Valley. Crikey, they are rattling off the locations, aren't they? And there's more in Gruntilda's head in Mad Monster Mansion, the waterlogged room in Rusty Bucket Bay, and finally, opposite the entrance to Click Clock Wood. Blimey, that's a lot of jiggies. Then we move on to extra lives, marked with a little golden Gruntilda statue. Apparently you can raise the water in the lair to its highest level to get one. Find one behind Gruntilda's hat, behind the house west of the mansion, and above the entrance to Click Clock Wood again. They seem keen on Click Clock Wood, don't they? Spellbooks are next, with Cheeto looking rather smug. The tips say exit the mansion as a pumpkin, head across the lava path, and Cheeto is inside. Then, enter the pipe left of Freezy's picture as a crocodile. And lastly, raise the water again, go to the ship and climb the stairs to meet Cheeto again. Sounds like a bit of back and forth for these spellbooks. Finally, Mumbo tokens, with Mumbo's gurning face. First, go through the first note door and down to the cauldron it's hiding behind it. Then, up the ramp, into the big drain pipe, again with the cauldron. After that, above the entrance to Clanker's Cavern on the painting of Click Clock Wood, behind the mummy's tomb again, above the entrance to Freezy Peak again, behind Mumbo's chair in the house in Mad Monster Mansion, to the left of the Mad Monster Mansion picture, to the right of Rusty Bucket Bay underwater, in the cave left of the mansion picture, and finally, behind the 765 note door. Good grief, they are scattered everywhere, aren't they? You'd be busy for hours just token hunting with this lot. Anyway, that's the lair covered apparently. All the secrets laid bare, just like that. I suppose for those stuck in 98, pre-internet walkthroughs, this was gold dust. Remember spending ages just wandering about aimlessly in games back then? Those were the days, in a way. The next page here is all about Banjo-Kazooie, specifically Mumbo's Mountain. It's a how-to guide, walking you through grabbing all the jigsaw pieces in that level. They start off with how to deal with Conga, that big ape throwing oranges. Apparently you need to dodge the orange projectiles and then use the Beak Buster move when he's stunned. Seems simple enough, even if Conga does look a bit grumpy for a monkey throwing fruit. Then there's another jiggy you get, by using the flat flip jump, to get onto Chimpy's trunk, and pelting Conga with eggs. That sounds like a right laugh, doesn't it? Next up they talk about going to Ticker's house, and finding a jiggy in the stone circle, which they call a Stonehenge-style circle. A bit grand, isn't it, for a few rocks? Apparently it's hidden in the center. Then there's another jiggy, hidden in one of the huts in the village. You have to use the Beak Buster to find it. And apparently the other huts have goodies, whatever they might be. Finally, it mentions a jiggy in Mumbo's house's eye, and to use the flat flip jump to reach it, and another jiggy up on the hill near the village. And then they say to transform into a termite, and climb Ticker's house for another jiggy right at the top. Warrington Norgroup. So yeah, just a standard step-by-step guide for getting all the jiggies in Mumbo's Mountain. Pretty helpful back in the day when you were stuck, before the internet told you everything. This page is all about Banjo-Kazooie, proper classic that, on the N64 of course. It's one of those how-to guides, you know, trying to help you find absolutely everything in the game, bless 'em. First up it's Bottles the Mole. He's gonna teach you new moves. Apparently you can learn egg firing above Chimpy, Talon Trot near the stone circle, and Beak Bust near Mumbo's house. Very helpful, I suppose if you were completely lost, which you probably were at some point in that game. It was massive. Then there are Jinjos, those little coloured critters you had to collect. 5 of them for a jigsaw piece. Sounds about right. The guide points out a few locations, like behind the starting platform and on an island surrounded by water. Everyone was hunting for Jinjos, weren't they? Gete. Mumbo tokens are next. You needed those to see Mumbo Jumbo the shaman chap. Says you need 5 tokens. Locations given are behind the platform where the first Jinjo is, from Chimpy's tree, in Ticker's house, behind the stone circle and under the ramp to Mumbo's house. All pretty standard stuff if you were playing in Ticker's house. Honeycombs are for extra health, always handy. Shoot eggs at Juju's mouth, and you get a honeycomb piece. Apparently there's one if you jump on top of Juju and flat flip jump. Another is in a cave near Ticker's house, accessible as a termite. Termite transformations, now there's something you don't see every day. Henty. Extra lives, always a bonus, hidden under huts and at Ticker's house. Groundbreaking stuff, eh? Henty. Which switch is mentioned? From Chimpy's trunk, jump to a platform and go left to find it. Hit it as a termite to get a jigsaw. Which switches? Always a bit obscure those were. Warrington no. Finally, difficult notes. These were hidden underwater in caves below the second Jinjo. Difficult notes? They weren't kidding sometimes, were they? So yeah, a typical guide page really. Back then, you lapped this stuff up. Trying to get every last thing in Banjo, it was an obsession for a while, wasn't it? Good times. This page then, is all about Treasure Trove Cove in Banjo-Kazooie. Blimey, remember that game? Seems like ages ago now. It's one of those step-by-step guides, showing you how to grab all the jigsaw pieces in the level. They're starting you off battling Nipper, that little crab fella, and then diving into the water to find Captain Blubber's treasure, bless him. They're telling you to use all sorts of moves, like the rat-a-tat-rap and Beak Buster, moves we probably knew off by heart back then. There's something about shock spring pads to get to a cave, and even firing eggs at a bucket called Leaky to lower some water. Honestly, the names in these games. Then it's on to flying from the ship's mast and bashing crosses on towers. Seems like good old Rare humour, wasn't it? All a bit daft, but we loved it back then, didn't we? It's a decent enough guide, I suppose, if you were really stuck on finding all those jiggies. Those were the days, eh? This page is all about Banjo-Kazooie, as if we needed more hype for that game back in 98. It's a how-to guide from an N64 mag, walking us through Treasure Trove Cove. First up is Bottles, that mole, teaching us 2 new moves on this level, which is handy. Then we have Jinjos, those colourful little guys, hiding in their usual spots under piers, on pillars, the tops of trees, you know the drill. Collect all 5 for a jigsaw piece, every little helps. Liwa. Mumbo tokens are next, for transforming into something later, apparently. It points out a few locations, like on top of Captain Blubber's mast, and behind Nipper's shell. Honeycombs are underwater near Nipper, and you need to swim around to find them. Standard platformer fare. Extra lives are on Shark Food Island, making your way up the tower, but falling down the first gap. Seems a bit risky for an extra life if you ask me. There's a witch switch hidden behind the lighthouse, which will fire a jigsaw piece from a cannon, naturally. And lastly, difficult notes, in Nipper's shell again, and on the masthead. So yeah, standard guide page for a collectathon like Banjo, telling you where all the bits and bobs are, probably useful for some kids back then, or maybe for when you were stuck after a good few hours of playing and couldn't be bothered to search every nook and cranny yourself. Good times, good times. This page in N64 Magazine is giving us the lowdown on grabbing all the jigsaws in Clanker's Cavern from Banjo-Kazooie. Ah, Banjo, what a game that was back in '98. Proper platforming, none of this gritty realism nonsense you get these days. So it looks like they're walking us through how to snag all 6 jigsaw pieces in this level, step by step with screenshots. Proper platform. First up, it's all about releasing Clanker by twiddling some handles in his stomach, which sounds delightful, doesn't it? Once the big metal shark is freed, apparently a jigsaw appears on his back. Nice and easy. Then, they're telling us to jump on the island, shoot a gold tooth, because why not? And get another jigsaw from his mouth. Sounds a bit dentisty if you ask me. After that, we're standing on a bolt in Clanker's blowhole, which is as dignified as it sounds, to get to a higher platform and another jigsaw. They say to walk along the path to collect it, which sounds simple enough, even for me after a few pints. Next, it's diving down by Clanker's left fin, to find a jigsaw behind a grate, and going through a pipe. Always with the pipes in these games, aren't there? Warrington though. Then we're back on Clanker's fin again, jumping onto a high platform, and firing eggs at another grate. Which again, seems like a normal day in the life of a bear and bird duo. Apparently, there are snippet mutants to fight, and another jigsaw piece is waiting. Finally, we're diving into Clanker's blowhole, again, and dodging slicers to get to another room with green rings to swim through for the last jigsaw. And if you're feeling flash, apparently you can fly through a high gap with Wonderwing to meet Bottles and get some gold. Always good to meet Bottles, he's a helpful chap, if a bit short-sighted. Underwing. So there you have it. All the jigsaws in Clanker's Cavern, according to N64 Magazine. They made it sound almost easy, didn't they? We'll see about that when I get the N64 fired up later. This page then, is from an N64 mag, back when we actually used magazines for tips and tricks, can you believe it? It's all about Banjo-Kazooie, that classic platformer. Seems to be a guide to finding bits and bobs in Clanker's Cavern, that underwater level. So first up we've got Bottles, easy peasy one to start with. Apparently you just need to use the flight pad after going through some green rings to get to him. Standard Bottles tutorial stuff really, teaching you the moves. Chorus, Jorichu. Next is Mumbo tokens, which everyone was always after for Mumbo's transformations. This section details how to grab a few, involving shooting Clanker's tooth, swimming around, classic Banjo gameplay. They even show you where a token is hidden behind a window ledge in a tunnel. Sneaky. Tai. Then there are honeycombs, those little health upgrades. This one looks like it's near Clanker's left fin, swimming up a pipe. Always good to max out your health bar. Jinjos are next, those colourful little blighters you had to rescue in every level for jigsaw pieces. This one's a yellow Jinjo, and it's behind the beehive on a platform. They were always hiding in plain sight, weren't they? War. Extra lives, always welcome in games like this, and this one is on a platform near the left fin too. Seems like the left fin area is a hotspot for goodies. You have to fall down a shaft, and then follow another shaft upwards. Bit of a detour for a life, but worth it. The witch switch section shows how to ground pound Gruntilda's eyes in her lair, standard stuff for getting a jigsaw piece. Etus. Finally, difficult notes. They're showing you to check passages in the ring area and on pipes above Clanker. Bet they weren't that difficult for most of us back then, were they? Nos? All in all, a handy little guide page for Banjo if you were stuck back in the day and didn't have the internet at your fingertips. Remember those days? Madness. This page here is all about Bubble Gloop Swamp from Banjo-Kazooie. Looks like a jigsaw walkthrough. It's got a bunch of screenshots showing off the level. You know, the usual swampy stuff with the big egg and the crocodiles. They're running through the jigsaw pieces you can grab in the level. There's hitting bandages on an egg with Kazooie, which is always a bit of a laugh. And using the beak buster on switches with a timer. Classic platforming stuff. Then there's dealing with those annoying little flibbit creatures. And those turtles in tanked up stomach. Bit weird that stomach level, wasn't it? Oh, and firing eggs into golden crocodiles, and even going inside a big croc's nostril to fight Mr. Vile, that memory game boss. Says here you almost certainly need speed shoes for that Mr. Vile bit, which is probably right, those mini-games could be a bit of a pain without them. Yet Bubble Gloop Swamp, not the easiest level but had its moments, didn't it? Looking back at these screenshots, it's pretty colourful for a swamp actually. Good times, good times. This page right then, it's one of those how-to guides for Banjo-Kazooie, eh? Looking at it, it's all about finding the hidden bits and bobs in the game, you know, the usual stuff to help you get further. So, first off, there's Bottles, telling you where to find him early on to learn the Kazooie's protective wellies move. Handy, I suppose, for wading through muck. Then we have Mumbo tokens. 10 of these blighters are needed to see Mumbo, and they're dotted all over the place behind Jinjos, in caves, near big eggs. Typical platformer collectathon. Honeycombs are next, for extra health of course. One is apparently above the conductor in Tanked Up's body bit weird, that and another inside Mumbo's house. And for a third, you gotta do a flap flip from the orchestra stand. Sounds like a bit of a faff, Jeshua. Which switch, that's for unlocking a jigsaw in the lair. Apparently you have to jump in a large pot, in a hut in Tree Hut Village. Right you are. Jinjos of course, you need to find all 5 in each level to get a jigsaw piece. They give you locations for a couple, like near bridges and in caves, and even behind a crocodile head. Always hidden in daft places, aren't they? Mass. Extra lives are mentioned, on top of a large egg and at the base of Tree Hut Village, and you can get more by beating Mr. Vile a few times. Mr. Vile, eh? Sounds like a right charmer. Gating gay. Finally, difficult notes. One's on top of the match above the blue Jinjo and another is apparently with Mr. Vile. Notes are always a pain to collect, especially the high up ones. Jickery. So, yeah, standard tips and tricks page really. If you're stuck on Banjo-Kazooie, which most people probably were at some point back then, this sort of thing was quite useful in the mag. Before the internet really took off, these mags were your best bet for figuring out these games. This page right, it's a guide for getting jigsaw pieces in Banjo-Kazooie, specifically in Gobi's Valley. Oh, Banjo-Kazooie, what a game that was back on the N64. Everyone was buzzing about it, trying to collect every last jiggy and note. So this page, it's breaking down 10 jigsaws in Gobi's Valley. Number 1 is all about climbing up that Sphinx, Jinxie they call him, and sneezing on him with eggs, as you do. Then there's flying through hoops of idols, which sounds like a bit of a faff. There's another one behind a pyramid involving Kazooie's beak, and running shoes are mentioned for beating the clock. Classic platforming stuff really. They're also talking about a sun pyramid, Wonder Wing, and matching tiles, which sounds a bit like a puzzle section. Then there's Gobi the camel himself, poor sod trapped under a block, you have to free him with the beak buster. Later on it's carpets, moving faces, and another maze section to find a sarcophagus. They really did pack these games full of stuff, didn't they? Fiesta. Finally, it's about using the beak bomb, which I vaguely remember learning in Freezy Peak, and hitting targets in a pyramid. And something about climbing up Histup. It's all quite detailed for a magazine page. They really did try to help you get every single last thing. Good times, good times. This page is showing us some tips and tricks for Banjo-Kazooie. Proper classic that was, eh? Looking back at it now, it's from an old N64 mag, must be from back in '98. Judging by the September 1998 at the bottom. Right then, so it's all about finding stuff in the game. We've got sections on Bottles, showing you how to learn the Turbo Talon Trot move from him, which was pretty essential later on. Then there's Honeycombs, telling you to bash a switch near the Sun Pyramid and fly through a cactus. Sounds about right for Rare's quirky logic. Mumbo tokens are up next, always useful for Mumbo's transformations. It's listing a few locations, like behind Jinxie, in the Sun Pyramid, and in the Race Pyramid. Collecting those little skull tokens was a bit of a chore sometimes, wasn't it? There's a section on the Witch Switch. For opening up secret areas, it mentions one in the maze and another in the lair, on top of the sarcophagus. Jinjos are covered too, those colourful little critters you had to rescue. This page is pointing out locations like behind you at the start, in the cave, and at the base of the maze pyramid. All for a jigsaw piece, naturally. Extra lives are mentioned, found on top of the Race Pyramid. Inside the maze and behind Jinxie. Never could have too many of those in Banjo, could you? Finally there's difficult notes, found in Jinxie, with the 9th jigsaw piece, in the Sun Pyramid and in the Race Pyramid. Getting all the music notes was a proper completionist challenge, wasn't it? Jekyll. Yeah, this page is a handy little guide for finding some of the collectibles in Banjo-Kazooie. Good memories of hunting for all this stuff back in the day, when game guides in magazines were actually useful before the internet spoiled everything. This page in N64 Magazine is all about getting jigsaws in Freezy Peak from Banjo-Kazooie. Remember that one? It was Christmas all year round in that level, wasn't it? So yeah, jigsaws, the bread and butter of Banjo, and they're showing you how to snag a few in this snowy world. First up, they're telling you to jump on a polar bear, and apparently, he just burps out a jigsaw piece. Right, easy peasy. Then it's all about jumping into a massive Christmas tree, because why not? Apparently there's another jigsaw just hanging out in there. Pete. Next, it's beak bombing buttons on a snowman's chest. Sounds a bit violent for Christmas spirit, but hey, it's banjo. After that, you've got to be a good Samaritan and give pressies to Boggy the Walrus's kids. Located in the tree, behind the snowman and on the snowman's nose apparently. Bit of a treasure hunt then, isn't it? And lastly, it's the classic race against Boggy on a sled, and then on foot, for the final jigsaw. Gotta love a good race against a walrus. All in a day's work for a bear and bird duo, eh? Good times. This page then, from the looks of it, is a little guide for Banjo-Kazooie, bless it, showing us where to find all sorts of bits and bobs in Freezy Peak. Right at the top, it's telling you how to find Bottles, who's hiding behind the Christmas tree presents. Good old Bottles, always teaching you new moves, in this case the beak bomb attack. Handy that. Then there's Honeycombs, apparently there's one under Sir Slush in the village centre, and another you can get by going into Watter's cave as a walrus and through a tiny passage. Sounds like a bit of a faff, but you know, gotta get those honeycombs. It mentions killing the Killer Frosty for one too, and jumping into a pool of water for another. Classic platforming stuff, eh? Mumbo tokens are up next, and blimey, there are loads listed here. In Boggy's igloo, on the sled ride, by the snowman's legs, both of them apparently near Bottles again, in Watter's cave. Sounds like they're dotted all over the place. Remember having to collect absolutely everything in these games? Hours we spent doing that. You needed 15 tokens to see Mumbo Jumbo, according to this. Next is the Witch Switch, found under Sir Slush opposite the Christmas tree. Apparently, hitting this releases a jigsaw piece in the advent calendar in the lair. Always loved a good switch puzzle, didn't we? And jigsaw pieces, naturally they're showing us where to find Jinjos on a tall present, on the snowman's broom, inside Watter's cave, above Mumbo's house, and behind another house after leaving Mumbo's hut. These Jinjos were always a bit fiddly to find, weren't they? Difficult notes are mentioned on the snowman's head, of all places. And lastly, extra lives. After the sled race, behind the icicle. So there you have it, a handy little guide for Freezy Peak, for all those completionists out there, back when we actually had to rely on magazines for tips like this. Imagine that, pre-internet days. Madness. This page is showing us the jigsaw solutions for Mad Monster Mansion in Banjo-Kazooie. Looks like a guide for those tricky bits. Right then, number 1, they're telling you to get to the top of the house and go down the chimney. Typical platforming puzzle, that is. Number 2 seems to be about barrels in the cellar and shooting them with eggs. Classic banjo stuff. Number 3, eggs in pots in the church garden. Simple enough. 4, church tower again, climbing I expect. 5, bit of wordplay involving glass tumblers to spell out BANJOKAZOOIE bet that took a bit of figuring out back then. Number 6 is something about copying Mott's hand on keys inside the church. Sounds musical. Number 7, smashing glass at Nappa's house, and going down the lavatory as a pumpkin. Now that's a bit bonkers, isn't it? And finally number 8, pumpkin again in a maze near the church tower, and then onto Nappa's roof, via a drain near the front of the house. Blimey, they really packed those jiggies away in some odd places, didn't they? Still, good times were had puzzling these out back in '98, eh? This page then, looks like a proper retro guide from N64 Magazine, showing us how to find all sorts of bits and bobs in Banjo-Kazooie. Ah, Banjo-Kazooie, what a game that was back then, eh? So yeah, this is a how-to page, and it's all about finding absolutely everything in Banjo-Kazooie. It breaks it down into sections, like Mumbo tokens, telling you that you need 20 of those to see Mumbo. It lists a load of places to find them, like on the broken roof, in the maze, in the lavatory. Classic Banjo-Kazooie humor there. Then there's honeycombs, which everyone was always after to get more health. This page is telling you to use the fly pad in the church to get up to the wooden beams to find one, and another one is apparently under the floorboards, disguised as a pumpkin sneaky. Yeah. Next, Witch Switch. Sounds a bit cryptic. Apparently you fly up to the roof inside the church and hitting this switch makes a jigsaw piece appear on Gruntilda's face in the lair. Intriguing stuff. Jinjos are there too, those little fellas you had to rescue in every level. This guy points out a few locations like on top of Nappa's house, above the green pond, and in a barrel in the cellar. You needed to collect all 5 for a jigsaw piece too, naturally. Extra lives are covered, mentioning behind the organ pipes in the church, and inside the secret church room accessed through a Banjo-Kazooie stained glass window. Wonderfully obscure, just how we liked it. Finally, difficult notes, and these are apparently found with the 9th jigsaw piece and in Nappa's house. Sounds like a late game thing, those difficult notes. Wiggy. Overall, It's a handy little guide for completionists back in the day, wanting to grab every last thing in Banjo-Kazooie. Reminds you how much stuff was hidden away in those games, didn't it? Good times. This page is all about Banjo-Kazooie, specifically Rusty Bucket Bay, that level with the ship. It's one of those jigsaw guide pages you used to get, showing you where to find all the bits and pieces. Looking back at it, they weren't always that helpful, to be honest. Sometimes you were better off just figuring it out yourself. Anyway, this one goes through getting various jiggies on the ship level. It starts with using the beak barge to raise a cage, then shooting eggs, and smashing windows. Classic Banjo stuff. There's even one where you have to use a TNT crate with a crane. Sounds a bit fiddly. And of course you gotta deal with those propellers, remember those? Nightmare fuel they were. Always felt like you'd get minced if you weren't careful. Apparently you can slow them down, but it's still not easy, they reckon. Very helpful. No, yeah. There's something about hitting whistles in a certain order, and smashing portholes, which is probably obvious once you know, but back then you'd spend ages wandering around clueless. And finally, it ends with something about diving underwater and releasing Snorkel the dolphin. Snorkel, eh? These games did love a daft name. Looking at the screenshots, it all brings back memories of that slightly blocky N64 look, but it was amazing at the time, wasn't it? Yeah, Rusty Bucket Bay, not my favourite level to be honest, a bit grim and industrial, but you had to get all those jiggies to finish the game. Good times, even if it was controller chewing frustrating at points. This page, we're looking at a how-to guide from an old N64 mag, and it's all about finding stuff in Banjo-Kazooie. Remember Banjo-Kazooie? Came out around '98, proper classic on the N64, platformer made by Rare. They were on fire back then, weren't they? Anyway, this page is showing you where to find all the bits and bobs like Mumbo tokens, honeycombs, witch switches, Jinjos and extra lives. For Mumbo tokens, there are loads dotted around the ship level. Places like on the gangplank, front of the boat, in the portholes and all that. Honeycombs are from Jinjo 2 onwards. Looks like you have to do a bit of diving and flap jumping to grab them. Witch switches, always a pain. This one's on top of a radiator, and you need to use a TNT box and crane to get to it. Sounds like typical Rare trickery. Jara, Jinjos, the little blighters, they've hidden 5 of them as usual, for a jigsaw piece. One's behind a grate, another in the toxic pool, and the rest are scattered about, even one right by the TNT crane toll. And extra lives you can get one by smashing TNT crates near the blue containers, in the engine room, and in the grey shed. Down at the bottom it's got difficult notes, just saying engine room and porthole rooms are places to watch out for. Which, yeah, cheers for that, bit vague isn't it? Still, useful enough at the time if you were stuck trying to 100% Banjo, which we all were, weren't we? Good times. This page then we are having a look at Click Clock Wood, in Banjo-Kazooie. Seems to be a guide on how to grab all those jigsaw pieces scattered around. It's broken down by seasons, spring, summer, autumn and winter, which is quite clever I suppose for a game level. For spring it's all about finding eggs and using the beak buster, then carrying an egg up a tree. Typical Banjo stuff. Bit of platforming for a jigsaw. Summer has you using the beak buster on a plant on Gobi's hump, and feeding caterpillars to Airy, that bird. Then it's into a beehive, which sounds a bit hairy, and using invincibility to deal with bees. Of course you do. Autumn sees you going back to the plant and stomping Gobi again, more caterpillars for Airy, and then swimming to Naughty's lair, inside a treehouse, and finally helping Nabnut the squirrel with acorns for winter. Winter is just a quick visit to Airy for another jigsaw piece. It's all laid out with little screenshots to show you where to go, which is pretty handy back then before everyone had the internet in their pocket. You actually had to buy a magazine for tips like this, can you imagine? Still, Banjo-Kazooie was a cracking game, even if sometimes you were scratching your head wondering what to do next, so these guides were lifesavers back in '98. This page is a guide, typical of what you'd find in N64 Magazine back in the day, showing you how to find all the little bits and bobs in Banjo-Kazooie. Ah, Banjo, what a game that was. It's all broken down into sections like Mumbo tokens, honeycombs, witch switch, extra lives, Jinjos and even difficult notes. It's like they knew we'd be scratching our heads trying to find everything. They've got little screenshots to help, showing you where to look during spring, summer, autumn and winter, which is a bit clever, referencing the game's world changing with the seasons. It's all about collecting stuff, typical platformer shenanigans, but we lapped it up then, didn't we? Always gotta find every last token and Jinjo. It's a good reminder of how much detail they crammed into those games, making sure you explored every nook and cranny. Gotta hand it to Rare, they knew how to make a collectathon fun, even if it did mean following guides like this one sometimes. This page then, is a how-to guide for Banjo-Kazooie, specifically on how to defeat Gruntilda. It's got the usual bright colours and screenshots we expected back then, from N64 Mags. Looking at the guide, it's broken down into numbered steps to beat Gruntilda in the final battle. Apparently her first attack is to charge at you on her broomstick, and you need to sidestep to avoid her. Then you gotta chuck eggs at her when she stops. Seems straightforward enough. Cheshires. Next it says she uses magnet spells, and throws fireballs. You need to be on the battlements, and fire eggs at her again twice, on each side of the castle, before she moves on. Then it's on to using the flypad and beak bombs, to attack her while she's stationary in the air, but not too high, or you'll miss. Finally you have to grab honeycombs, and shoot eggs into holes, on Jinjo statues, to make her fall out of the sky, and finish her off. Sounds like a bit of a faff, but that's Gruntilda for you, always got to make things complicated. There's also a top tips box suggesting you start the fight with loads of eggs and feathers, and to use Cheeto spells if you're struggling. Always good to have those cheeky cheats available. A double up box mentions getting 890 notes to open the last note door in Gruntilda's lair for double energy. That sounds useful for making the fight a bit easier. And a cheats section mentions getting more cheats from bottles after completing the game. Always something to keep you playing, I suppose, even after you've seen the credits roll. Overall, it's a decent enough guide. Pretty standard stuff for back then, you know, just in case you were completely stuck on that witch. This page is all about how to find absolutely everything in Banjo-Kazooie, right then. It's from N64 Magazine, and it's teasing the endgame secrets. They are being all coy about it, saying censored, over some palm trees, typical magazine hype of the time. Basically, if you managed to collect all 100 jigsaws, apparently you'd see one of two end sequences, the longest in any Nintendo game they reckon. Which sounds like a bit of an exaggeration, doesn't it? They are teasing some good end scenario if you get everything, but being all mysterious, saying Rare is being cagey about what it actually is. Brilliant, but not 100% clear, is it? All will be revealed next month in the mag, where all of Banjo's secrets will be laid bare apparently. They are even banging on about speed challenges to see who's best at this game of the summer. Bit much, but that was magazines for you back then. As for the actual gameplay tips, there are bits and bobs about attacking Gruntilda, using beak bombs at the right height, and how a couple of eggs in each statue will release a Jinjo to help you attack Gruntilda. They mention Gruntilda doesn't stop firing fireballs, so you gotta be quick. Then there is something about releasing all 4 Jinjos to make a mighty Jinjonator statue appear, and you have to fire eggs into holes at its base. Apparently the statue doesn't give you any cover from the fireballs, so you just have to keep moving. Standard stuff really, for anyone who played it. This page from an old N64 mag, issue 19 it looks like, is all about getting your hands on 1080 snowboarding before it was officially out in the UK. Remember those days, having to wait ages for games? The article is titled, How to Beat Nintendo and Play 1080 Snowboarding Right Now. It's written by James Ashton and it's all about import gaming, which was a bit of a faff back then. Tendo. Apparently Nintendo thought it was too summery to release a winter sports game in the summer here. Typical marketing, eh? The good old Australia and New Zealand were already getting it, because their winter is our summer, so the magazine is suggesting you import an Australian copy if you couldn't wait until November. It talks about PAL and NTSC regions, and all the hassle of converter boxes, and Japanese N64s if you went down that route, but says getting an Aussie copy is much simpler as they use PAL like us, so it should just work on a standard UK N64. There's a little box that mentions they reviewed the NTSC version of 1080 way back in issue 14, and there are a couple of screenshots from the game itself, showing some snowy mountain action, and the game's interface with time, damage and speed. Looks pretty basic by today's standards, but back then, 1080 snowboarding was a pretty big deal, very shiny and new. Seems like Martin from the magazine was the resident 1080 champ, according to a little caption, and they're even joking about boarding on a penguin. Ah, classic N64 magazine. This page is all about getting your hands on and getting the most out of 1080 snowboarding on the N64. At the top it talks about buying the game, and back then you had to consider importing if you wanted to get games early, especially from places like Australia. They mention that it could cost a bit more than waiting for it to arrive in the UK, but you could get it sooner. They even give you phone numbers for importers, and mention the exchange rate for Australian dollars at the time, which is quite retro now. Then, the fun bit, how to get the secret borders. It gives you the lowdown on unlocking Iceman, Pandaman and Goldman and even a penguin board. For Iceman you had to beat him in expert match race mode on Deadly Fall. Pandaman was a bit more involved, you had to put your initials on every single record screen and then do a button combo with Rob Hayward right C and A Goldman. You needed to beat him using Iceman in expert match on Deadly Fall. And the penguin board, that was all about doing every trick in training mode and then another button combo with Akari Hayami, holding bottom C and pressing A twice. Those were the days, weren't they? Hidden characters and button presses were the height of gaming secrets. Finally, there's a little box called Why the Fuss, reminding us that they reviewed 1080 back in issue 14 and gave it a whopping 89% and a Star Game Award. They thought it was the best snowboarding game, but wondered if it would last because it was only 1 or 2 players and had 6 tracks. But they admit they kept going back to it, especially for time trial mode, reckoning that's where the real depth was, trying to shave off seconds. They even hint they might have to review the PAL version again and maybe even bump up the score, saying you won't be disappointed if you get a copy early. Classic magazine stuff from back then, getting hyped about the latest games. This page from N64 Magazine looks like it's from back in the day when you actually had to phone a premium rate number if you were stuck in a game. Remember those days? Anyway, it's a tips page clearly aimed at helping us lot out with some games. It starts off with a bit of a chinwag about someone from DMA Design popping in with a copy of Body Harvest. Remember that one? They were banging on about having to navigate crocodile pits to get to the hotline back then. Cheeky sods. They're also still working on the Banjo-Kazooie guide, saying they've uncovered all the secrets, and are looking forward to Banjo 2, bless them, always forward-thinking these magazine types. Then it jumps into All-Star Baseball, 99. They've got some tips, like how to pick runners off second base by being a bit crafty with the pitch and watching the runner's feet, and how to get a free strike against the computer by bunting. Seems a bit cheap if you ask me, but hey, a win's a win. And for a laugh, they mention slow motion mode. Apparently you can muck about with the camera in the options, and even get slow motion going, using the D-pad. Sounds like a right giggle for messing about. Ooh. Lastly, there is a big chunk on NFL Quarterback Club 98, and it's just a load of cheat codes. I mean loads of them. There's codes for weakening defenses, offense, maximum everything, all that sort of thing. Then you get into the proper daft stuff like electric football mode, slippery pitches, giant players, miniature players, and even one to turn all the cheats off if it all gets a bit much. Remember spending ages typing these long codes in from magazines? Those were the days, eh? This page is all about tips and the Nintendo hotline, proper retro stuff back when you actually had to phone up to get cheats. It's from September 1998, so smack bang in the middle of the N64 era. It's advertising the Nintendo hotline, saying they've got expert gamers ready to help you out, open 7 days a week. Imagine that now. They even had an automated service for the wee small hours, which sounds like a right pain to use, costing 50p a minute and needing a pen and paper ready. Bet that was popular with the parents. Worky. Hattie. The main game featured here is Tetrisphere. Remember that one? It was a bit different, a 3D Tetris thing, kind of weird but strangely addictive. They've got Puzzle 67 walkthrough here, going through step-by-step instructions on how to clear it, lots of moving cursors and sliding purple L-shaped pieces and blue squares around. Sounds like a right head-scratcher. Seems like they were giving away all the secrets to beat it. Good job if you were stuck, I suppose, but maybe took the fun out of it a bit, didn't it? This page from the mag is the tips extra bit. First up, it's some tips for snowboard kids. Remember that? Bit of a laugh that game was. They've got some trick moves listed, but the real meat is Mortal Kombat 4, naturally. It's all cheats and codes, just what you wanted back then. They tell you how to do easy fatalities, because who could actually remember the real combos? And how to play as Noob Saibot, always a cool hidden character. Then there's a table of combat codes, those 3-digit numbers you'd bash in before a fight. Things like big head mode and silent combat, proper daft stuff. Good times. And yeah, some screenshots, to show you what it all looks like. The next page in this issue then, is all about readers' top 10 tips. Classic stuff from N64 Magazine. It kicks off with a tip for GoldenEye, suggesting you can shoot people in the cutscenes, particularly on Surface 1. Right, cheers James from West Midlands, probably spent ages figuring that one out. Then there's a convoluted one for Fighter's Destiny, about getting extra moves by messing about with memory packs. Sounds like a right faff but might be worth it if you were really into it. We've got one for GoldenEye again, this time for an easy win in Capture the Flag. Just stand behind your flag. Simple as. And another wrestling one, WCW vs NWO. Something about 2 human players needing to team up to beat Conjon, whoever he is. ISS64 gets a mention for an easy goal trick, run up to the keeper and then do a chip, apparently. GoldenEye crops up yet again. This time it's a cheat to get illegal weapons in the depot level, and rockets on a table. Quake 64 has a cheat for infinite ammo by messing with the weapon options, which sounds handy for that game. Diddy Kong Racing gets a tip to beat Octopus Boss, by typing in TEENY, WEENIES, and staying inside the track to avoid bubbles. Cryptic as always these cheats were. Top Gear Rally has a tip about holding all the C buttons at the title screen, though why I'm not sure. And rounding it off, GoldenEye again, with a tiny Bond cheat that lets you hover if you crouch and walk slowly off stairs. Sounds like a laugh, if you had the patience. Below that we have Reader's Daytel codes. These were the days before everything was online and you needed these add-on devices, likely for action replay, listing loads of codes. There are codes for Clay Fighter 63 1/3, with things like infinite energy, character items, and a superbar. Then there's a bunch for Mario Kart 64, for stop lap time, multi-green and red turtles, lightning bolts and invincibility, all the usual suspects to spice up a race. Nagano Winter Olympics gets some love with codes for pressing AR button for first place and resetting time close to 0. And finally WCW vs NWO, with a code for time always being 0 and for hidden characters, and even one for an aluminium baseball bat. Madness, and a final one for Top Gear Rally to race only one lap in championship mode. Ratbow. Looks like they are asking for more tips, and to send them into the magazine you could even get a pin badge if your tip was good enough. And Cheat of the Month got something extra special. Those were the days, eh? Good times. This page is the letters page from the mag. Always a good chuckle to see what folks were moaning about back then. Someone called Simon's written in with a decent suggestion actually, saying they should put info about memory pucks and how much space games need for saves in the reviews. Fair point. And Ed, bless him, says they're already on it from this issue onwards. Good on 'em. Then we've got a couple of right grumps complaining about the Perfect Dark cover, thinking it was GoldenEye 2. Bless. Martin and Nikki are both a bit miffed they didn't get GoldenEye 2, and instead got this Perfect Dark game. Ed's had to explain that Perfect Dark is sort of GoldenEye 2, in a way, you know. Same team, same engine, all that jazz. They got some new shots and info from Rare, so it wasn't a total con, was it? Still, easy mistake to make back then. Hype was mental. Kidaka. Christopher is banging on about the Donkey Kong cartoon. Seems he's a fan, rattling off all the characters. Donkey, Diddy, Cranky, Funky, Candy, Dixie, and loads of others. He even quotes the theme tune, Banana Slammer, Congo, Bongo's Hero. Catchy, I suppose. Correction Corner is always good for a laugh. Seems they accidentally gave Diddy Kong Racing a 90% score when they meant 62%. Ouch. Someone else is complaining about the goblins in the Mission Impossible feature in issue 18 looking a bit dodgy, and the colors being off. And someone else is moaning about the How Do Games Get Made feature going owl. Bruce is having a pop at the colors in Mission Impossible 2, says they look a bit suspect. Finally, William is being a proper pedant about Aqua being Danish, not Dutch. Oh dear. Ed's taking it all on the chin, fair play. Delia. Last letter is from someone called, Think About It, suggesting a multiplayer GoldenEye mode where you race through levels and fire rockets. Sounds a bit bonkers, but hey, why not? Whooplie. And of course, there's a big old screenshot of Perfect Dark slap bang in the middle, looking all moody and mysterious. You could see why they were pushing it as the next big thing after GoldenEye, couldn't you? Even if some folks got their knickers in a twist about it not being exactly GoldenEye 2. Good times. This page has a right proper blast from the past in it, doesn't it? Kicking off with readers' letters, someone's going on about Diddy Kong Racing being better than GoldenEye with guns. Well, each to their own, I suppose, but GoldenEye was the bee's knees at the time. Then there's a bit about someone bragging they finished foot race with Cooper the Quick in 2 seconds in Mario 64 cheeky sod. And a tip about cheating in the same foot race, jumping out of bounds to get a better start. Those were the days of finding all the little glitches. Moving on, there's a fact box, trying to explain the whole PL versus NTSC telly business. It's all about why Japanese and American games might not work on your UK N64 or run properly. Something about different TV systems and Nintendo trying to stop you importing games, mainly for business reasons apparently. They mention about cutting bits out of US cartridges to make them fit. Blimey, gamers were dedicated back then. It also touches on how older conversions just squashed the picture and made it all wrong, but newer games, like since Lilac Wars, were properly converted for full screen and speed. Down at the bottom they've got a Dream On section, with some reader ideas for games. First up is Armada 64, sounds like some big space strategy game, Command and Conquer in space sort of thing, for the N64. Bit ambitious perhaps? Then there's Yoshi's Safari 64, a remake of the old SNES game but for the N64, with a light gun. They reckon it'd be like Mario 64 meets proper 3D worlds and Turok, with loads of blood. Bit much for Yoshi, isn't it? There's even a little screenshot mock-up of it, looks a bit rough and ready, proper N64 style. They mention Kemco's Knife Edge light gun game, and how it's tricky getting light guns working properly in 3D games. Good luck with that then, eh? September 1998? Good times, good times. This page of the magazine kicks off with the Club 64 letters, where readers are moaning about the usual stuff. Analog sticks breaking, mums doing daft things with consoles, you know the drill. Someone called Dave Ridpath is having a right old time with his mum. Sounds a nightmare. There are some suggestions for Perfect Dark, like shooting out lights and using laser sights, which is a decent shout actually. Then there's Sharon suggesting a cleanse mode for ISS64, bit weird but each to their own. Moving on, the bonus letters section has Tom Riley having a pop at the dodgy titles thing, which is a bit of a laugh. Jamie Campbell reckons Banjo-Kazooie is a baby's game, probably hasn't even played it. David Styles from London is proper excited about Perfect Dark after seeing the screenshots, and fair enough, it did look pretty amazing at the time. Then we get to So Tell Me This, which is the Q&A bit. Loads of questions about ISS98, and whether you can create a player from ISS64, typical footy game questions. Someone's asking about WCW vs NWO Revenge having a ref, and a wrestler walkway. Ben Wood is thinking big. Alan Monaghan wants to know if Acclaim still have the Alien license and fancies an Alien Trilogy game, which would have been cool. Michael Shields is wondering about another Doom game and Polygon baddies, and asking about the old Superplay writers, Alison Harper and Ollie Alderton, wonder what happened to them. And someone is asking about World Cup 98, and the Game Boy graphics, and Buck Bumble and Tonic Trouble, games I vaguely remember. Answers are pretty standard. Wait and see, not included yet, that sort of thing. Lastly, there's a bit called 352, where Ian Hutchinson has picked his Nintendo X iFooty team. Gex is in goal, Cooper and Fox McCloud on the wings, bit of a random team really, with Donkey Kong, Bowser, Banjo in there too, along with Mario, Luigi, Goemon, Turok and Ryuji. He says he'd swap Ryuji for James Bond for a suave and stylish midfield, showing his age a bit there, bless him. Ed's taking the Michael a bit, saying Turok with a very large gun in defense, always with the sarcasm. This page from the N64 magazine takes me right back to being a kid, doesn't it? Right then, so it's got this invention corner bit first, talking about some Aussie bloke, Griffin Liada something, who's come up with the projector pack. Sounds a bit mad, like something out of James Bond. Apparently it lets each player have their own private screen in multiplayer games by projecting their bit of the screen onto the wall. Bit of a faff, innit? They're wondering about battery life, and if the tech even works, which is fair enough. Sounds like a clever idea to get around needing loads of tellies for multiplayer, mind you. Ooh. Then there's the Sumo controller. Apparently, this Naidako Bodhi fella has made this massive controller, the size of a watermelon. They reckon it's not going to improve Ozumo 64 gameplay, which, let's be honest, wasn't exactly setting the world on fire anyway. Moving down, we've got the N64 board, which is all readers' letters and drawings. Someone called James has lost his details to get a badge, poor sod. There's a super happy picture from Amanda Boone, and a really impressive character montage by Adam Charlton, who's only 13. Blimey, artistic types. These N64 owners, Anthony Woods and Laurie Eggleston, get a shout out too. There's drawings of Mario, Yoshi kicking a football, Zelda, and even a weird cat thing from Rat Attack. Someone's drawn Sonic and Crash Bandicoot looking a bit worse for wear as well. Chuwe. Corind. Then there's a section with questions. Jamie Hart from Stockport wants to know about using the hoverbike in Perfect Dark multiplayer. The mag says not quite, and lists a load of Mario Kart 64 tracks that don't have shortcuts, like Moo Moo Farm, Toad's Turnpike, Sherbet Island, Bowser's Castle, and Banshee Boardwalk. Bit of a random answer that. Richard McMahon from Liverpool asks about football management games on the N64. Sadly, the answer is no. There aren't any at the moment, but maybe in the future. Overall, a pretty standard page for the mag back then, showing off some bonkers inventions and readers' stuff. Good times. This page in N64 Magazine, issue 19, looks like the back pages, the classifieds, where you went to find pen pals and maybe some cheap games. The pen pals section shows people looking for mates, and unsurprisingly, they're mostly into Nintendo. Street Fighter was still popular back then, and some folks were proper fans. Football and movies are mentioned too. Pretty standard interests. Then there's games to swap, a reminder of the days of cartridge trading. Yoshi's Story comes up a few times, must have been a common trade. Goemon, or Mystical Ninja, a decent game. GoldenEye, and Diddy Kong Racing, proper classics, everyone wanted those. Wave Race 64, another good racer, is there too. Someone is even trying to swap the puzzle game Wheatrix. Fighter's Destiny and Pilot Wings are also in the mix for swaps. 2. Lastly, games for sale, where you could grab some bargains. Mario Kart 64 seems to be about £30. Top Gear Rally, maybe not quite as sought after. A universal adapter is for sale, remember those slightly dodgy devices? Someone's selling a retro collection, a bit vague on the details. Lilac Wars, or Star Fox 64 as we'd call it, also about £30. SNES Earthbound is listed bit niche back then in the UK, but becoming a cult hit now. Turok Dinosaur Hunter, always a good blast, also £30. Anime videos are on offer too, some classic titles like Urusei Yatsura Macross, cheap as chips. And there are Japanese Bomberman and Turok imports, maybe a bit pricey at £25, £30 back then. Fighter's Destiny appears again, maybe not as desirable if it's in the for sale section as well. Basically a classic look at the N64 scene in the late 90s. This page looks like the TAC-T Reader ads section. Brings back memories, doesn't it? Small ads for all things Nintendo, how quaint. Right, let's see what people were flogging or after back in September 98. There's a section for games for sale, someone's trying to shift Extreme G, and maybe swap it for GoldenEye. Good luck with that swap, GoldenEye was king back then. Another one's got sets of anime videos, remember those? Harkenden and 3x3 Eyes, hardly used apparently, for 55 quid. Blimey. Norse, Games Wanted, always a popular section. Someone's after N64 Magazine issue 1, probably worth a bob or two now if they kept it mint. Another person is desperate for Chessmaster, for Game Boy. Chessmaster, on the Game Boy. Each to their own I suppose. Virtual Boy Wario Land is on someone's list too, they're willing to cough up to 50 quid for it. Must really want it. And finally, someone is after Fighter's Destiny, maybe to swap for Diddy Kong Racing or Lilat Wars. Lilat Wars or Star Fox 64 as the Yanks call it, classic game that way boy. Help wanted, this is a bit of a laugh. One poor soul needs help getting over 4,500 on Snowboard Kids trick game. Snowboard Kids, yeah, remember that one. And someone else wants cheats for GoldenEye. And some good tips. Cheats for GoldenEye. The internet was still a baby back then, so you had to rely on mags like this or playground rumors. Cheats for GoldenEye. The Gaboo. Lastly, fanzines. RPG collector's items, issues 18 of Roll Call for 20 quid, and a bigger collection with t-shirt for 200. Sounds like someone's clearing out their attic. And that's your lot, a snapshot of what people were after, and getting rid of Nintendo-wise back in the day. Simple times. Don't forget to fill out the form if you wanted to get in on the action yourself. Block capitals only. And send it off to Bath. Probably all digital submissions now, eh? How times change. This page is having a bit of a laugh, calling it The Great Nintendo Car Boot Sale, Cheeky Blighters. It's an article looking back at old Nintendo games, from the proper old Game & Watch handhelds right up to the SNES era, and even a cheeky nod to the N64. They reckon Nintendo are the best games company ever, which, well, back then you could see the argument for sure. The writers, Jason Moore and Martin Kitts, are reminiscing about how amazing Nintendo were and still are, saying even old NES and SNES games still look good, even compared to the fancy 3D stuff we were getting used to. They're talking about how back in the day gameplay was king, not just flashy graphics, and how much effort went into squeezing games onto those little cartridges compared to the massive N64 games. Bit of a point there, mind you. They're wondering why you'd bother with old stuff when you've got Mario 64, GoldenEye, and Banjo-Kazooie, but then immediately defend the retro stuff, saying Nintendo games are hardly ever rubbish. They've got a section called How They Rate, looking at innovation, fun factor, and collectability, which is always a laugh as we all know how crazy prices can get for boxed retro games these days. There's a picture of a Zelda Game & Watch box and console, and a SNES, proper classic bits of kit. They're going on about how collectability is a hard thing to judge, and that even something like the Mona Lisa is worthless if no one wants it, which is a bit deep for a games mag, innit? All in all, a nostalgic look back at the good old days of Nintendo, just as the N64 was hitting its stride. This page from N64 Magazine, right, takes us back to the old days of Nintendo, before the N64 even really got going properly. So look at some classic games you could pick up for a song back then, probably even cheaper now if you look hard enough. Or in a C. First up there's Mario Tennis. Blimey, £20 they wanted for that. It was on the NES, Game Boy, and even the Virtual Boy. Remember that red headache machine? They say it launched the Game Boy, which is a bit of a stretch, but it was a decent tennis game for its time, even if the Virtual Boy version was a bit much. Tafja. Then Dr. Mario, another tenner. Basically Tetris but with pills. Frustrating? They say yeah, try playing it after a few pints and see how frustrating it is. Still, good for a quick go on the Game Boy. Next, Picross, also £10. That puzzle game where you crack codes to draw pictures. Never really took off, did it? Addictive for some, I suppose, but not exactly Mario 64, is it? Oi. Duck Hunt, for a £5. Now that's proper retro. The Zapper light gun, shooting ducks on your telly. Simple pleasures. They call it a rural sports simulator. Bit posh for a duck shooting game. In it? Kin it? Pin it in it. Popeye, another fiver. Nintendo's first licensed NES game apparently, based on the old Game & Watch stuff, and they reckon the graphics were good. It was alright I guess, if you liked Popeye. Mario Clash on the Virtual Boy, again £20. Seems pricey for the Virtual Boy, even then. Another Mario game, this time a puzzle thing in 3D. Devilish cunning, they say. Sounds like a right load of old tosh, but maybe it was alright if you were desperate for something to play on your red goggle machine. Mario Bros on the Atari 2600, only £3. Mario's first go on a home console, though it was a bit basic compared to what came later. They say Nintendo characters popped up on other consoles even back then, like Donkey Kong and Link. Blimey. Jow. Kirby's Adventure on the NES, £4. They call it Mario's main rival on the NES. Kirby's Dream Land came out on the Game Boy too. Apparently, Kirby's some kind of genius character, and they were still waiting for him to appear on the N64 back then. Patience is a virtue, eh? F1 Race on Game Boy, £3. Racing on the Game Boy wasn't ideal, but this one was alright, apparently came with a free adapter for multiplayer. Pocket Fun they called it. Warrington Nulsa. Golf on Game Boy, £4. One of the first Game Boy games. Tiny cartridge, 14 courses, link-up play. Good for commuters apparently. Kept you quiet on the train I suppose. And right down at the bottom, some of the real old stuff. Ball on Game & Watch, £15. The first ever Game & Watch, back from 1981. Silver Range. Simple juggling game, but they say it's the best of them. Bit pricey for a juggling game, even then. Finally, Mario's Cement Factory, Color Tabletop Game & Watch, £13. Fancy double screen, Game & Watch in color. A proper arcade machine for your tabletop. Big hit back in '84. They reckon it's one of the best Game & Watch machines ever made. Not bad for a bit of nostalgia. This page then is having a look at some of the old classics, proper retro stuff in fact, games from way before the N64 even existed for some of them. First up is Donkey Kong 3 on the Game & Watch Micro VS, bit of a blast from the past that, always good for a quick two-player bash. Then it's the Super Mario Land series on the Game Boy, which is fair enough, they were alright for handheld Mario. Very different from the console ones though, weren't they? Next we've got the Metroid series across the NES, Game Boy and SNES, describing it as rough and ready, which is maybe a bit harsh, but yeah, Metroid and Super Metroid were properly moody games compared to some of the brighter stuff, a bit more grown up if you like. Then there's Yoshi's Story on the N64, they reckon it disappointed SNES fans looking for a Yoshi's Island update, which is probably true, it was a bit different wasn't it, maybe a bit too cutesy for some, but still a decent game, especially with that singing Yoshi on the title screen, they're not wrong about that. Ice Climber on the NES is next, proper old school from '84 no less, bit of a weird and obscure game but kinda fun in a strange way, bashing those wee Eskimos up the mountain. Battletoads on NES and SNES is there, they call it one of Nintendo's most compelling games, which is maybe pushing it a bit, it was tough as nails, but yeah, graphically it was impressive for the NES at the time. Warrington Killer Instinct on the SNES gets a mention as the big arcade beat-em-up from '94, brash and loud it certainly was, trying to be all cutting edge with the graphics, remember everyone going on about the per-rendered sprites? Wario Blast on the Game Boy is next, comparing it to Bomberman, which is about right, another solid handheld game from that era. Super Mario RPG on the SNES is there, reckoning it's got beautiful graphics for the machine, and Mario's first 3D appearance, which technically, sort of, yeah it was, Jesha War. Donkey Kong Jr. on the Color Tabletop Game & Watch gets a shout out too, calling it a classic slice of handheld gameplay. With a flip UP lid, they always were a bit fancy those color Game & Watches. Stunt Race FX, or Wild Tracks as they called it in some places, on the SNES is mentioned, saying it was a polygon racer that was better than it looked, which it probably was. Under all those chunky polygons there was a decent racer. Finally, Legend of Zelda on the Game & Watch, saying it was the most innovative of the range, dual screen and all that, a bit more complex than the earlier simpler games. All in all, a decent look back at some of the old games that came before the N64 took over. This page of N64 Magazine is having a look at some older Nintendo titles in what they're calling a Great Nintendo Car Boot Sale. Right at the top we've got Mario Kart 64 on the N64, still going for a hefty 30 quid mind you, even though it was out a while by now. They reckon it's still great for multiplayer, and yeah, the turbo drifting was a laugh. Q. Then it's back to the NES with RC Pro-Am for a mere £8. They're comparing it to Super Sprint in the arcade, which is fair enough. It was a decent top-down racer back in the day, with those pseudo 3D graphics they mention. Next up is Kirby's Block Ball on the Game Boy for a tenner. A breakout clone, basically, but with Kirby. They say it's addictive, and I suppose it was alright if you were into that sort of thing on the Game Boy. Poobie. Moving on, we've got a few Donkey Kong games. First is Donkey Kong Land for Game Boy, also a tenner. They're saying it's impressive they got SNES-style graphics on the old monochrome Game Boy screen. It was a bit of alright to be fair, even if it was a bit green and blurry. Then there's Donkey Kong G&W, that orange double-screen Game & Watch thing for 20 quid. Apparently, it caused more exam failures than strict teachers. A bit of an exaggeration, maybe, but those old Game & Watches were pretty simple but strangely addictive in their way. Donkey Kong Country on the SNES is up next for £20 as well. They call it a contest for best graphics, and they mention Killer Instinct as the only thing close. It was a looker for the SNES, that's for sure, with all those pre-rendered graphics, even if the gameplay was maybe a bit slow compared to some. Pilotwings 64 on the N64 is 25 quid. They're saying it's more of a relaxation technique than a game. It was a bit of a tech demo for the N64 really, showing off what it could do, flying around those 3D landscapes. Pretty chill, I suppose. Mate. Proper old school now with Donkey Kong the arcade game for a whopping 50 quid. They're saying it invented platform games and made Nintendo famous. Well, it's a classic, can't argue with that. Proper hard though, even now. Star Fox, or Starwing as it was called here, on the SNES for £17. They're banging on about the Super FX chip and how impressive the 3D was. It was mind-blowing at the time, even if it looks a bit blocky now, compared to proper 3D. Kirby's Pinball on Game Boy for £8. They say it's simple but addictive. Pinball games are always alright for a quick go, and Kirby makes everything a bit cuter, doesn't he? EL. Super Punch-Out on the SNES is 15 quid. Definitive boxing game they're calling it. It was good fun, with all those cartoon characters and learning their patterns. Button bashy but satisfying when you figured it out. Lastly, F-Zero on the SNES, also £15. Single-handedly defined futuristic racing genre is a bit strong, but it was fast and looked great at the time. Proper white-knuckle racer, that one. So yeah, a bit of a trip down memory lane, looking at these old games and what they were going for back in the day, and what they're worth now, makes you feel a bit old, doesn't it? This page in N64 Magazine is having a look at some stone-cold classics and a few newer titles, giving them a bit of a score out of 5. Starting off with Tetris on the Game Boy, they're saying it's just essential, you can't think of one without the other, can you? They reckon it's still the best handheld game going. Why? Then it's Super Mario Bros. On the NES? Well yeah, obviously. They're calling it the first proper platformer and how Mario 3 really nailed it. Biggest game of all time apparently. Bit much maybe, but it was massive back then. Way sure. Wario Land for the Virtual Boy is next. Bless the Virtual Boy. They're saying it was made for it, and it's a decent platformer in 3D, if you could stomach the red and black screen. Worth a look apparently, if you don't mind risking your eyesight, they joke. B. Blast Corps on the N64 gets a mention, and they're saying it's unlike anything else. Highway Encounter and Rampage are mentioned, but they're stretching it a bit. Original idea, and good fun they reckon. Pilotwings on the SNES is next, saying it's hard to pin down why it's so good, just really playable. They think the SNES version is better than the N64 one, more about fun than being realistic. Renewvoir. Wave Race on the N64 is there too, and they're banging on about the water effects, saying they're still amazing and better than the arcade games. Graphics will get old, but it's still a top racer. Yoshi's Island on the SNES is next and they're calling it the ultimate platformer, a real high point for 16-bit games and a great swan song for the SNES. Star Fox 64, or Lilat Wars as they call it here, on the N64, is featured too. They're saying it brought shoot-'em-ups back, and the freedom to move about is great. They also mention the Rumble Pack, calling it something new that'll be on every controller in the future, which, yeah, they weren't wrong there. Diddy Kong Racing on the N64 is up, and they reckon Nintendo got beat by Rare at their own game. Bit harsh. It's like Mario Kart, but with new characters like Banjo, who's got his own game, and Tip Top, Pipsy and Timber. Legend of Zelda is mentioned across the NES, Game Boy and SNES. They call it a proper arcade RPG, and the Game Boy version and colourful SNES versions are both great. Wondering if the N64 one will be better. Warrington Mailwoe. Lastly, Super Mario World on the SNES. They say it's the game that launched the SNES and had everything Mario and more. Must-have game, and a real achievement to find all 96 exits apparently. This page then, right, is one of those investigates features, all about finding more retro gaming stuff online. Bit of a weird one for an N64 magazine back in '98, but alright. First up they've got GoldenEye 007. What can you say? Everyone was obsessed back then, weren't they? They're saying it was the greatest first-person adventure ever created. Bit strong maybe, but it was a good laugh with your mates, wasn't it? They reckon it takes months to explore properly, which is a bit of an exaggeration, but it was massive for its time, I suppose. £50 they're saying for it now. Blimey. Then there's Mario Kart on the SNES. Cutesy Racer they're calling it. Well yeah, it is a bit, but still brilliant fun, even now. They're going on about clipping the blocks off the walls and using thunderbolts. Proper skills that were, eh? £20 for that one, Ethel. And Super Mario 64, still looking amazing even in a tiny screenshot. They're banging on about Nintendo inventing the platformer with Donkey Kong and then reinventing it again. Bit much, but it was mind-blowing back then, wasn't it? Monumental achievement, they're saying. £40 they want for it now. Geet. Then they move on to websites to find more retro stuff. Video Game Advantage at eo.com/Vega 2000. They say it's outstanding. Pictures. Trading old consoles. Sounds like the sort of thing we were all trying to find back then. NES World at internet1.net/NES World. Best NES site around apparently, with obscure game art. Alright. And Gigu, Clint's handheld webpage at best.com/Claudia. Comprehensive list of Game & Watches and handhelds. Game & Watches. Remember them? Simple Times. Drenot. Planet Sinclair at nvg.unit.no/Sinclair/Planet. Place to go for 8-bit games, like Ultimate's Golden Oldies. ZY Spectrum and C64, that's proper retro, in it. And finally, the Annaly Retentive's Retro Games Home at art.demon.co.uk, for emulators for machines you've probably forgotten ever existed. Annaly Retentives. Bit of a weird name, that. Warintentives. They're saying use a search engine, post on bulletin boards, and you might even find a crystal screen Mario Game & Watch. Good luck with that, eh? Those things were rare as rocking horse poo, even back then. Still, good suggestions I suppose, if you were desperate to get your retro fix on the internet in '98. This page is previewing what's coming up in N64 Magazine. Looks like they are teasing Wipeout 64, saying Psygnosis are joining the N64 team, which is decent news if you're into that sort of futuristic racing. Apparently they are going to Liverpool to rifle through their files. Bit dramatic, isn't it, Dariaka? They've also reviewed a bunch of games. There's Buck Bumble, which was alright, a bit of a kiddie game really. IS-98, which is International Superstar Soccer 98 for those not in the know. Konami always do a solid football game. Then Pocket Monsters Stadium, obviously that's Pokemon Stadium for us lot, looks like they're still calling it Pocket Monsters here. Mortal Kombat 4, which was alright, though 3 was probably better to be honest, and Gex, that gecko platformer, wasn't really my cup of tea if I'm honest, but someone must have liked it. Rude. And it says and loads more, so who knows what else is in there. It's all under a reviewed banner, so yeah, looks like a review issue. Oh, and it reminds us, N64 Magazine is the UK's best-selling, well, good for them. This page then, issue 20 of Planet 64 Magazine it is, back in September 1998. Right on the cover we've got a big splash for 64 in orange, and the number 20 in massive white font, so they are making a point of the issue number, must be getting up there. The main headline is all about WWF Warzone, telling us how to slap like a good 'un with their ultimate guide. Bet that was popular with the lads at school. There's a little red badge saying 132 pages for your N64, so it was a beefy issue then. Down the right side in yellow circles they are teasing what's inside. First news on loads of new N64 games. Well, that's always good, isn't it? Skill Club 64, no idea what that was, but probably some tips and tricks thing. I'm the best, bit of a bold claim, hopefully they can back it up. And finally, loads of tips, more tips then, never enough tips, eh? Then there is a box shouting about another fantastic double game guide plus, and they mention more secrets uncovered for 2 of the N64's best games. The little images next to it show Pilot Wings 64 and Yoshi's Story. Pilot Wings, yeah, that was alright, and Yoshi's Story, well it's Yoshi, isn't it? Nice and colourful, maybe a bit easy for some, but still fun. Morju. Below that, there's a black question mark box, promising a very special extra free gift worth £. Probably a sticker or something exciting like that, you know how it was back then. And finally it says on sale Tuesday the 8th of September, so everyone would be rushing to Smith's to grab it after school. Right at the bottom in a yellow banner it says N64 Magazine Official, just to make sure you knew it was the real deal. And there you go, issue 20 all wrapped up. This page is from issue 19 of the N64 magazine. Looks like they've got a quiz going. You could win £50, which wasn't to be sniffed at back then. The quiz questions themselves are testing your knowledge of the mag, asking things like how many games Kemco are publishing in this issue, who's that racer's dad in F-Zero X, and even about mystery games from Rare. There's also questions on Turok 2 weapons, and what ODT stands for, remember that one? They're even asking about Mario games in the Great Nintendo Car Boot Sale, cheeky. The screenshots are from F-Zero X and Turok 2. Seeds of Evil, looking pretty good for the time, chunky polygons and all that. On the right, there's an index to the issue, so you can see what's inside. Looks like they reviewed 1080 Degrees Snowboarding, All-Star Baseball, Banjo-Kazooie, Chopper Attack, Desamon, Earthworm Jim 3D, F-Zero X, Gex 64, Iggy's Wrecking Balls, Mission Impossible, Star Soldier, and WWF Warzone. Previews for games like Glover, Hybrid Heaven, IS-98, Knife Edge, Madden 98, ODT, Snowboarding, and Winback. They even had a future look at Glover and Top Gear Overdrive, trying to get us hyped up early. There's also features on the Great Nintendo Car Boot Sale and special investigation on Turok 2 weapons. Looks like they've got their usual tips extra and Skill Club 64 feet for hints and cheats, and some news and RPG news bits to keep us in the loop. To enter the quiz, you had to send your answers to some address in Bath. Good golly quiz folly, bit of a mouthful. Closing date was September 15th, 1998. Good luck to anyone who actually entered, probably got a vegetarian pizza for their trouble, knowing magazines back then. And finally, at the bottom it says this issue was on sale August 11th, with the next one coming out September 8th. So there you go, a snapshot of N64 gaming, back in the day. This page is a look at a cover from N64 Magazine back in September 1998. Right in the middle, you've got Mission Impossible, splashed across a red backdrop with that classic fuse burning, teasing the release date of September 11th, cheeky considering what the future held, eh? The headline is, Expect the Impossible. Pretty standard marketing spiel for a movie-tying game, wasn't it? Down the right side, they're listing all the reviews in this issue. Let's see, they've got Mission Impossible itself, of course, then Iggy's Wrecking Balls, that was a weird one, wasn't it? WWF Warzone, all the wrestling games seemed the same back then. All-Star Baseball, F-Zero X, now that was a proper game. Star Soldier, Off-Road Challenge, and Desamon, which was a bit of a niche title if I recall. Then there's a section called Other Great Stuff. Looks like they're covering Turok 2 Special Investigation, Banjo-Kazooie Complete Solution, Gotta Love Rare back then, Hybrid Heaven, Top Gear Overdrive, IS-98, Knife Edge and Glover. Remember Glover? Mad game that was. They also mention how to get a PAL copy of 1080 Degrees right now, always keen to help with imports. And something about every single N64 game reviewed and rated, the Great Nintendo Car Boot Sale, Skill Club 64, I'm the Best, and N64 Contacts. Blimey, they packed a lot in. At the bottom, there are little screenshots for Knife Edge, Glover again, Winback, Madden 98 Feet, American Football, never really got into that myself, and ODT. A little advert at the bottom left, bragging about over 50 pages of new N64 games. Yeah, those were the days, weren't they? N64 was really hitting its stride then,